Welcome to the 16th century, a place where logic went on holiday, religion ruled daily life, and superstition filled in every gap left behind by reason. You didn't just believe in God, you also believed that the devil lived under your neighbour's chicken coop, that dreams could predict royal deaths, and that if you saw a hare before breakfast, you might as well go back to bed and start writing your will. In Tudor England, the supernatural wasn't fantasy, it was Tuesday. Hello, travellers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you're listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. To understand how deep superstition ran, imagine living in a world with no science textbooks, no Google, and no antibiotics. When your cow stopped giving milk, you didn't suspect infection, you suspected witchcraft. When lightning struck your roof, it wasn't bad luck, it was divine wrath, or worse, a bored sorcerer showing off. Everything had meaning, nothing was random. Life was one long cosmic guessing game, and the prize for guessing wrong was usually plague. Even the church, the supposed authority on what was holy and what was heretical, couldn't decide where to draw the line. Priests denounced magic in their sermons, but then turned around and blessed amulets, just to be safe. A holy relic might heal you, or it might just be someone's finger bone from the cemetery. Religion and superstition were so intertwined that even scholars struggled to tell the difference. Faith offered comfort, but superstition offered control, or at least the illusion of it. When everything from weather to childbirth could kill you, having a few magical backup plans seemed only sensible. Superstition wasn't reserved for monks and mystics. It was baked into everyday life. Peasants carried lucky charms. Merchants crossed themselves before opening shops. Nobles hired astrologers to tell them when to propose marriage or when to invade France. If your bread dough rose too high, it wasn't yeast, it was a message from the heavens. And if it didn't rise at all, clearly someone had cursed your oven. The Tudors didn't live in a rational world. They lived in one thick with symbols. A blackbird at your window meant death. A white dove meant peace. A candle that flickered during prayer meant an angel was near, or possibly a draft. Even the smallest moments became dramatic omens. Life was exhausting. You couldn't sneeze without someone deciding your soul was halfway out the door. Everyday life was like living in a haunted escape room, and no one ever found the key. Before we laugh too hard at Tudor paranoia, it's worth remembering that life expectancy barely made it to 40. One bad harvest, one mysterious illness, one visit from a rat, and you were history. Science couldn't explain disease, astronomy, or why your neighbour's cow looked at you funny. Superstition filled those gaps with meaning, and meaning was comforting. It told you that the universe wasn't random, it was personal, maybe vengeful, but personal nonetheless. If your child got sick, it wasn't biology's fault. It was because you forgot to hang rowan branches over the cradle, or you crossed paths with an old woman who looked vaguely disappointed in you. Superstition provided order in a world that refused to be orderly. It also gave you someone to blame, and if you're lucky, that someone wasn't you. Religion didn't calm Tudor fears, it fed them. The Reformation had torn England apart. Catholics, Protestants, and everyone in between accused each other of heresy and witchcraft. People who switched sides at the wrong time often ended up on fire. The result? A nation convinced that the devil had a season pass to England. Church bells weren't just for prayer, they were believed to drive away storms and demons. Holy water could cure illness, but only if blessed by the right kind of priest. People prayed to saints for luck, protection, or the occasional miracle, and they often bribed them with coins, candles, or livestock. It was half devotion, half celestial negotiation. In short, heaven was busy, and everyone wanted a customer service upgrade. Religion promised salvation, but superstition offered a warranty extension. The Tudor world was neither purely medieval nor fully modern. It was the awkward teenage phase of human thought, old myths mixed with new discoveries. You had printing presses and plague doctors, astrologers and anatomists, monks debating theology beside merchants selling magical potions made of crushed emeralds. A scholar might lecture about planetary motion by day and pay a fortune teller to interpret his dreams by night. Superstition was democratic. Everyone had access to it. The rich bought astrologers, The poor made charms from hair, nails, and bones. Fear didn't discriminate. A king could consult a wizard as easily as a shepherd could consult a witch. It was all part of the great Tudor survival strategy. Trust God, respect the stars, fear your neighbour, and never ever forget to say bless you. So welcome to Tudor Superstition, a land where logic took second place to fear, and fear wore a rosary. A sneeze could summon divine intervention, a toad could cure a fever, and a woman with too many cats could be executed for weather control. It was an age of devotion and delirium, where the human desire to explain the unexplainable turned life itself into a storybook of strange rituals and cosmic paranoia. The Tudors didn't have fantasy novels, they just lived in one. The devil was blamed for everything from spoiled milk to stubbed toes, as his meddling was seen in every misfortune. If your butter wouldn't churn, it wasn't bad technique, it was Satan doing CrossFit in your pantry. Welcome to Tudor England, where the devil wasn't just a Sunday sermon topic, he was your least favourite roommate. Theologians wrote about him, neighbours gossiped about him, and milkmaids cursed him every time the cream went sour. To the Tudor mind, the devil was everywhere, hiding in storms, lurking in illnesses, and occasionally, yes, wreaking havoc in your kitchen like a demonic sous chef. In a world still wobbling between faith and fear, the devil wasn't an abstract symbol of evil. He was personal, active, and probably standing behind you right now, judging your cooking. In an age with no weather reports, no understanding of germs, and zero tolerance for coincidence, any misfortune needed an explanation. If your bread burned in the oven, the devil had slipped inside. If your cartwheel broke, the devil kicked it. If your horse refused to move, clearly the devil had hitched a ride. There was an entire vocabulary for this invisible meddling: the devil's work, the devil's wind, the devil's mark. People genuinely believed that Hell's CEO was running a very active field office in rural England. The devil's goal wasn't subtle corruption, it was daily inconvenience. He didn't just want your soul, he wanted your patience, your livestock, and your last decent loaf of bread. Hell hath no fury like a devil with free time and access to your barn. Food superstition was where Satan really thrived. If the butter wouldn't churn, witches or demons were blamed for bewitching the milk. Housewives muttered prayers over their cream, as if conducting an exorcism with dairy products. Bakers crossed their dough before baking it, not just out of piety, but to keep Lucifer out of the loaves, because nothing said divine protection like stabbing your bread with a small edible cross. Meat left to rot wasn't poor preservation, it was the devil's breath. If you burned your hand while cooking, clearly Satan was jealous of your pie, and if your ale went flat, it wasn't fermentation failure, it was the devil proving he hated good times. Even recipes sometimes included lines like, "Stir thrice widdershins, that the devil may flee." Imagine cooking dinner while spinning your spoon counterclockwise and glaring at invisible evil. That was Tudor culinary culture in action. Every Tudor kitchen was part bakery, part battlefield, part exorcism site. Beyond the pantry, the devil was believed to invade human bodies, quite literally. Diseases weren't caused by bacteria, they were the devil's fingerprints on your flesh. Sudden madness, epilepsy, or strange fits were labelled possession. The line between a medical condition and a demonic invasion was thinner than a communion wafer. Priests performed exorcisms using prayers, Latin chants, and sometimes, very questionably, physical violence. A priest might slap the afflicted person to drive the devil out. Sometimes the devil apparently left. Sometimes he just made things worse. Either way, the parish got a good show. Even ordinary bad moods had infernal explanations. A grumpy husband? The devil tempted him. A nagging wife? The devil spoke through her, a popular theory among men, not surprisingly. Anger, lust, and laziness, all Satan's handiwork. If it felt good, he inspired it. If it felt bad, he caused it. Truly, the devil was multitasking at Olympic level. He wasn't just evil, he was alarmingly efficient. People became amateur detectives of hell's influence. Strange shapes in butter, ominous shadows, odd noises in the chimney, all could be signs. The devil, it seemed, had an art degree in being vaguely unsettling. Animals often took the blame too. A black cat near your doorstep? Devil's spy. A toad in your well? Devil's messenger. A pig behaving strangely? Clearly possessed. Farmers sprinkled holy water on livestock as often as they fed them. The devil's reach extended from royal courts to chicken coops, leaving no soul or chicken safe. Even birthmarks were suspicious. They were called devil's marks, proof that someone had struck a supernatural deal. Some people were literally inspected for these marks during witch trials, often with terrifying results. The smallest mole could become a death sentence. The Tudors managed to turn freckles into felony evidence. Naturally, the church positioned itself as England's spiritual pest control. Priests warned constantly of the devil's tricks, but also, quite helpfully, sold candles, charms, and indulgences to guard against him. Every sin was a potential invitation to hell's party, and the clergy were more than happy to sell you the bouncer's blessing. Sermons described the devil in theatrical detail, horns, tail, and all. Woodcut prints portrayed him as a grotesque creature with goat legs and an unsettling grin, because nothing says moral education like nightmare fuel for children. Yet despite the fire and brimstone, people didn't fear the devil out of malice. They feared him out of familiarity. He was everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life. Ironically, blaming the devil made the world feel more manageable. If something bad happened, it wasn't your fault, it was hell's interference. You could fight back with prayer, charms, and holy bread. You could outwit evil, one superstition at a time. In a strange way, the devil gave people purpose, a cosmic enemy to resist. To live in Tudor England was to live in a spiritual tug-of-war, with every stubbed toe reminding you that somewhere, down in the sulphurous depths, Satan was keeping score and laughing. In Tudor England, even the devil worked overtime, mostly in your kitchen. If you lived in Tudor England and felt a mysterious pain, your options for medical help were limited, somewhere between hope it goes away and pray for divine intervention. Doctors were expensive, clergy were busy, and your local barber doubled as a part-time surgeon with a worrying enthusiasm for leeches. So for most common folk, there was only one place to turn, the village wise woman, a blend of healer, herbalist, midwife, and part-time miracle worker, who seemed to know what to do with every herb, wound, and awkward rash. But in the paranoid theatre of Tudor superstition, these women walked a tightrope between revered and reviled. One good healing could make you a local saint. One bad batch of ointment could make you firewood. Wise women were the unofficial healthcare system of rural England. Long before hospitals existed, they relied on centuries of oral tradition, the kind of practical knowledge passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, full of potions, poultices, and whispered prayers. If your child had a fever, she might brew willow bark tea. If your cow stopped giving milk, she'd tie a charm to its neck and mutter a blessing. Her remedies weren't based on science as we know it, but they worked often enough to build trust. These women knew the plants that soothed burns, stopped bleeding, and eased childbirth, all without reading a single medical text. They were, in a way, the original community pharmacists, and like any good pharmacist, they dispensed willow bark tea, sage compresses, and unsolicited moral advice. Unfortunately for these women, Tudor England was not a great time to be a woman with knowledge, independence, or opinions. Medicine was a male-dominated field, and learned physicians viewed female healers with deep suspicion. A man who mixed herbs was a botanist. A woman who did the same was a sorceress. It wasn't just sexism, it was fear. Wise women held power in a world where most women weren't supposed to have any. They understood life and death in ways that unsettled both priests and physicians. Their work took them into the most private spaces, births, illnesses, and even the deathbed. That kind of influence over both bodies and souls looked dangerously close to witchcraft to the Tudor imagination. If you were a man performing medical miracles, you got a title. If you were a woman, you got a trial. Becoming a witch didn't require much effort. In fact, you could do it entirely by accident. All it took was one suspicious neighbour, one failed cure, or one cow that decided to drop dead at the wrong moment. Let's say you gave old Mistress Anne some herbs for a cough. If she recovered, you were blessed. If she died, you were a murderer in league with Satan. Or maybe a neighbour's butter wouldn't churn. Suddenly, it was your fault because last week you refused to lend her your broom, and now she's convinced you cursed her milk. A few gossips later, and congratulations, you're officially in league with the devil, and someone's drawing up kindling. Accusations could spiral fast. In close-knit communities, grudges fermented quicker than ale. Jealousy, envy, or even property disputes could ignite full-blown witch hunts. Witchcraft was the Tudor version of social media outrage, fast, irrational, and potentially fatal. By the late 1500s, English belief in witchcraft hardened into something darker. Influenced by continental Europe's witch trials, Tudor theologians promoted the idea that witches made pacts with the devil, signing contracts in blood, receiving familiars animal demons, and renouncing Christianity. For the average villager, this was terrifying but also oddly cinematic. Picture it, an old woman in the woods, lighting candles, whispering Latin she doesn't understand, and summoning a demonic cat. It was nonsense, but deeply compelling nonsense. Many confessions from accused witches were extracted under torture or manipulation. Victims admitted to anything just to end the agony, flying through the night, transforming into animals, and attending midnight Sabbaths where they danced with demons. The authorities called it proof. In truth, it was collective hysteria mixed with bad theology. The devil apparently had a very busy social calendar, hosting midnight dances with women who couldn't even afford candles. Ironically, much of what these witches practiced was genuine herbal medicine. Modern pharmacology has confirmed that many of their ingredients actually worked. Willow bark for pain, aspirin, foxglove for heart conditions, digitalis, and mouldy bread poultices for infections. Hello, penicillin. But to a fearful public, the sight of a woman mumbling over a pot of boiling herbs looked suspiciously like dark magic. Even simple charms like tying rowan twigs above a door could be twisted into evidence of diabolical power. It wasn't what you did that mattered, it was how someone else interpreted it. You weren't brewing tea, you were apparently opening a small branch of hell in your kitchen. Witch trials weren't as common in Tudor England as they later became in the 17th century, but the seeds were sown here. Local courts could accuse, torture and hang women based on little more than gossip and spectral evidence, meaning someone dreamed you were guilty. Communities found comfort in these executions. They turned chaos into order. Bad luck got a name and a face, and once that face was gone, people felt safe again, at least until the next storm, plague, or spoiled batch of ale. Tudor justice was simple. When in doubt, find a woman, shout witch, and call it a day. Despite persecution, many wise women continued to practice in secret, blending faith, folklore, and practical medicine. They stitched the wounds of soldiers, delivered babies, and eased pain long before science caught up. Their reputation as witches outlived them, but so did their wisdom. Centuries later, their herbal knowledge would be rediscovered and celebrated, no longer heresy but history's first grassroots healthcare. In the end, the wise women weren't enemies of religion or reason. They were simply women trying to make sense of suffering in a world that punished them for understanding too much. In Tudor England, curing the sick was dangerous work, but at least your potions doubled as plausible deniability. Tudor England was a land of contradictions, and nowhere was that more obvious than inside its churches. The clergy preached that faith alone would protect your soul, yet they sprinkled holy water on barns, blessed wells, and sold charms that looked suspiciously like magical trinkets. Religion was the great referee between God and the devil, but sometimes it seemed like the church was hedging its bets. The average Tudor walked into a chapel not just to save their soul, but to negotiate with the supernatural. The priest was part theologian, part magician, and part insurance salesman for the afterlife. The church insisted that only God worked miracles, yet it also produced a dazzling array of holy objects that looked a lot like magic tools. Holy water drove away demons. Blessed salt protected food. A priest's prayer could purify, heal, or even silence thunder. Of course, these weren't spells, they were sacraments, which was a polite way of saying, yes, it's magic, but it's authorized magic. Priests blessed fields before planting, livestock before carving, and even weapons before battle. If a knight charged into war, it wasn't just armor he wore, it was a portable arsenal of relics, saints' bones and crosses tucked into every available strap. If you fell in combat, you might die, but at least you'd die pre-blessed. In Tudor theology, the line between sorcery and a proved miracle was basically who signed the paperwork. The clergy publicly condemned village healers and charmers for dabbling in the occult, but privately they knew that the same peasants who feared hell also wanted practical protection, and so the church adapted. Instead of pagan amulets, they sold medals stamped with saints. Instead of muttering Latin over herbs, priests muttered Latin over holy bread. The words changed, but the comfort was the same. People didn't really care whether it was Christ or cabbage doing the work. As long as their cow stopped limping, even the most educated bishops sometimes slipped. Records show priests using blessed parchment to ward off storms, or writing the name of Jesus on eggs to protect crops. Officially, this was devotional. Unofficially, it was spellcraft wearing a crucifix. If it quacked like magic and glowed like magic, but came with a church receipt, it was theology. Before Protestant reformers banned the idea, Catholics believed that souls in purgatory could visit the living to beg for prayers. That meant ghosts were real, or at least temporarily real, pending divine approval. This belief conveniently created an entire economy of salvation. You could pay for prayers to release your dead relatives, buy candles to guide them, or fund masses to shorten their stay. It was both spiritual compassion and brilliant marketing. Monks and priests told chilling tales of restless spirits haunting miserly nobles or negligent heirs. Whether or not they believed those stories, the lesson was clear: donate generously, or Grandpa might start knocking. The church couldn't exorcise every ghost, but for a small fee, it could make them someone else's problem. In Tudor life, blessings became the church's way to domesticate superstition. There was a blessing for ships, bees, wine, candles, ploughs, even weapons. On Candlemas, priests blessed thousands of candles to guard against storms, sickness, and sudden death. There were entire manuals detailing which saint handled which emergency. Saint Apollonia for toothache, Saint Blaise for throat problems, Saint Roch for plague, and for truly hopeless cases, Saint Jude, the celestial equivalent of tech support. Prayers were customized to life's inconveniences. If your hens stopped laying, pray to Saint Bridget. If your child wouldn't sleep, invoke Saint Margaret. For chronic flatulence, believe it or not, there was probably someone in heaven on call. Every saint was like a divine customer service rep, and heaven ran the busiest help desk in Europe. Then came the Protestant Reformation, and suddenly, all that holy magic looked suspiciously like idolatry. Reformers stripped altars, smashed relics, and called relic sellers merchants of superstition. Priests who once performed blessings now preached against them. But habits die hard. Ordinary people still crossed themselves, hung sprigs of rosemary over doors, and whispered Latin they no longer understood. Even Protestant ministers found themselves blessing harvests or using holy oil just in case. The Reformation didn't kill superstition, it just gave it new branding. The church could change its slogans, but the human craving for the mystical stayed exactly the same. You can reform religion overnight, but try reforming a farmer who swears his cow only calves on St. Agnes Day. What made the Tudor church so fascinating was its constant dance between purity and practicality. Official doctrine said, no magic. Everyday practice said, unless it works. A priest might denounce a villager for hanging charms, then bless his own wine to keep devils out. Bishops preached about reason, then approved processions to chase away storms with bells and relics. Everyone knew there was a wink in the system, a quiet agreement between fear and faith. The church gave structure to a chaotic universe, but it also made sure that chaos had a donation box. If the devil was England's most reliable villain, the church was its most enterprising middle manager. Even centuries later, echoes of these contradictions survive. When we cross ourselves for luck, light candles for the dead, or whisper prayers before takeoff, we're reenacting Tudor habits polished by time. The church may have shed its relics, but not its rhythm, the comforting illusion that a well-phrased blessing keeps the chaos away. In Tudor England, religion wasn't simply belief, it was performance, protection, and occasionally profitable superstition wrapped in incense smoke. The church didn't invent magic, it just gave it better lighting. In Tudor England, the world was one long horror movie. You just couldn't turn it off. Death, disease, curses, and divine punishment lurked behind every door. The average person didn't walk through life feeling safe, they walked through life feeling targeted. And when you couldn't rely on medicine, justice, or logic, the next best thing was to fill your pockets, coat, and probably your underwear with protective trinkets. To modern eyes, the Tudors looked like walking museum displays of superstition, wearing bones, ribbons, feathers, and bits of old wood. But to them, every item had a purpose. Nothing was random. A ribbon tied the right way could deflect evil. A bone from the right saint could save your soul. And if all else failed, there was always the time-honoured option: carry something dead and hope it worked. Tudor fashion tip: accessories make the outfit, especially if they confuse demons. There wasn't a single event in Tudor life that didn't have a charm for it. Bad dreams, sleep with bread under your pillow, toothache, rub your jaw with a dead man's tooth, freshness optional, sick cow, tie red thread around its neck and pray it doesn't notice. Charms were protection on the go, portable magic you could wear, hang or swallow depending on how desperate you were. They might include knotted strings, written prayers folded into leather pouches, or herbs sewn into little cloth bags. These witch bags were believed to keep out disease, evil spirits, and nosy neighbours. Children were especially loaded with charms: coral beads for teething, silver spoons for good fortune, and protective amulets pinned to their clothes so that evil spirits would get distracted before possessing them. Because apparently, even hell respected accessorising, Tudor childcare was basically feed them porridge and make sure they're covered in garlic and coral. The natural world was the Tudor pharmacy, but also the Tudor armoury. Plants weren't just medicine, they were weapons against misfortune. Rowan branches hung over doorways to repel witches. St. John's wort was worn in your hat to drive off demons. Garlic was stuffed in shoes for protection, and coincidentally, guaranteed social distancing. Animal parts were even more prized. Rabbit's feet, badger claws, and even frog bones were kept as luck tokens. Moles were particularly popular. People believed sewing a dried mole into your clothes could cure rheumatism. It didn't, but it certainly made you smell interesting. Some Tudors wore moles for healing. Others wore them just to make sure no one sat too close. While peasants carried mole bits, nobles preferred divine merchandise, holy relics. These were physical pieces of saints, Christ, or other holy figures, preserved like sacred souvenirs. The most famous relics included bones, teeth, and in one memorable case, an entire finger of St. John the Baptist. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to touch or even glimpse these objects. Touching a relic could cure sickness, forgive sin, or just improve your general chances of not dying before 40. Monasteries displayed them proudly, and the more dramatic the relic, the bigger the crowds. There were relics of Christ's blood, fragments of the true cross, and enough pieces of the Virgin Mary's veil to clothe half of Europe. The problem was, authenticity was flexible. Some holy bones came suspiciously from animals, and one English abbey famously displayed a vial of what it claimed was the Virgin's breast milk. No one asked how they verified that. The relic market was booming, half salvation, half souvenir shop. Religious jewellery was Tudor insurance against everything from plague to heartbreak. Crosses, medals, and rosaries were carried not just for prayer, but for luck. A silver crucifix might protect you from the evil eye, and a rosary blessed by a priest could double as a ghost repellent. Candles, too, were believed to hold divine power. A candle blessed on Candlemas could prevent storms, keep the devil away, and even ease childbirth pains, though probably not all at once. Some Tudors burned special beeswax candles while praying, convinced the smoke carried their words faster to heaven, like an early form of divine Wi-Fi. Prayer candles, the original spiritual broadband connection speeds vary. Not all charms were physical. Some were written, prayers, psalms, or mysterious Latin phrases copied onto parchment. People folded these papers and carried them in pockets, hats, or shoes. Others hung them over doors to keep out witches. These were known as brevia, or amulet prayers, and their spelling was usually appalling. Many people didn't understand Latin, so the sacred words often looked like gibberish, a beautiful tangle of miscopied syllables that somehow still promised divine power. You might not know what your charm said, but if it looked holy and smelled like ink, it was probably fine. By the later Tudor period, charms had become so common that even the clergy stopped pretending they weren't using them. Priests wore protective rings, bishops blessed travelling crosses, and nobles gave holy medals as romantic gifts. A Tudor courtier might carry a saint's bone next to a love charm, because one never knew whether the next day would bring romance or plague. Wearing religious tokens wasn't superstition, it was status. The more ornate your charm, the better your luck and your reputation. A simple peasant might carry a twig, a duke might wear a relic dipped in gold. Faith in Tudor England wasn't just spiritual, it was accessorized. Many of these traditions never died. When we wear cross necklaces, carry lucky coins, or keep charms on keychains, we're continuing Tudor habits without realizing it. The line between superstition and sentimentality has always been thin, we just gave it better design. For the Tudors, these charms weren't childish beliefs. They were survival strategies, armor against invisible forces that science hadn't yet named. Whether it was a rabbit's foot or a relic of a saint, every charm carried the same message: the world is dangerous and I'm doing what I can. The Tudors didn't believe in luck. They believed in giving luck a head start, preferably one attached to a rabbit. In Tudor England, if you wanted to understand your health, your luck, or whether your neighbour was plotting to steal your cow, you didn't ask a doctor, you asked the heavens. The Tudors lived under a sky filled not just with stars, but with instructions. Every twinkle above was an email from the universe, telling you what to eat, who to marry, and when to bleed someone with leeches. Astrology wasn't just a curiosity, it was science with flair. Kings consulted astrologers before battles. Farmers checked the moon before sowing seeds. Physicians used horoscopes as diagnostic tools. Even if you didn't know your letters, you probably knew your sign, and blamed it for everything from bad harvests to bad hair. Forget personality quizzes. The Tudors had star charts that told you exactly why your life sucked. The Tudor worldview placed Earth at the centre of the cosmos, surrounded by spinning crystal spheres carrying the planets. Each of these celestial bodies, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the Sun, and the Moon, emitted mystical influences that poured down upon the world. You, dear mortal, were basically a sponge soaking up cosmic energy, whether you liked it or not. Astrology explained everything that couldn't otherwise be explained. The planets controlled moods, health, and fortune. Saturn made you melancholy, Mars made you angry, Venus made you flirt too much, and the Moon, well, she made you unpredictable, which was her full-time job. When you were born, the alignment of the planets etched your personality like a cosmic tattoo. Your chart determined your strengths, weaknesses, and future, because of course it did. Born under Saturn? Congratulations, you're destined to worry professionally. In Tudor England, medicine and astrology were inseparable. Every respectable physician owned an astrolabe and probably talked about it too much. They didn't diagnose based on symptoms, they diagnosed based on sky maps. Before performing surgery, a Tudor doctor checked whether the moon favoured cutting. Operating while the moon was in the wrong sign could lead to excessive bleeding, which, ironically, was also the goal of most Tudor treatments. Bloodletting, for example, had its own zodiac calendar. Each body part corresponded to a sign. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on. You didn't bleed someone when their ruling sign was active, lest you anger the heavens or worse, make the patient even more unbalanced than they already were. A Tudor surgeon's motto: first check the stars, then stab responsibly. The stars didn't just decide when you should get your arm amputated, they also decided what you should eat. Tudor diet books recommended balancing your humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile according to the planets. Feeling sluggish? Maybe your moon was too damp. Eat something fiery to dry out your humours, perhaps roasted pork or a spicy pie. Feeling irritable? Too much Mars. Avoid red meat and loud arguments. Even vegetables had planetary affiliations. Lettuce was ruled by the moon, onions by Mars, and beans by Venus. A well-balanced Tudor meal wasn't about flavour, it was about cosmic harmony. If your dinner didn't align with your star chart, you weren't just unhealthy, you were astrologically offensive. Tudor nutrition, less about calories, more about avoiding Jupiter's disapproval. The stars also played matchmaker. Astrologers cast charts for engaged couples to see if their planets were compatible, not emotionally, but elementally. A fiery Aries woman marrying a watery Pisces man? A disaster. Too much steam. Royal marriages were no exception. Queen Elizabeth I herself relied on her court astrologer, Dr. John Dee, for everything from coronation dates to foreign negotiations. When to sail? Ask Dee. When to flirt with France? Ask Dee. When to avoid Mercury? Always. For common folk, astrologers offered love charms and compatibility readings for a price, of course. Many poor families spent their last coins ensuring their marriages were cosmically approved, because nothing says romance like planetary paperwork. Forget love at first sight. Love at first alignment was the Tudor way. Astrologers weren't just stargazers, they were influencers with dangerous power. Kings listened to them, rebels consulted them. Predicting an eclipse at the right time could make you famous. Predicting the monarch's death could make you dead. In 1552, astrologer Richard Harvey caused panic by predicting a world-ending flood. People fled to hills, selling property for pennies. When the flood didn't arrive, Harvey's reputation sank faster than his non-existent ark. But no matter how many predictions failed, the faith remained. The stars were too beautiful, too ancient, too authoritative to question. Even government pamphlets occasionally quoted the stars if it helped justify politics. The heavens favour the king, they'd declare, which, coincidentally, the heavens did every reign. Astrologers were like Tudor tabloids, dramatic, often wrong, and impossible to ignore. The church tolerated astrology, cautiously. After all, if the planets influenced weather and crops, that was God's design. But if they dictated free will, that was heresy. Theologians twisted themselves into theological pretzels trying to explain it. The stars incline, but do not compel, which basically meant the stars are right unless they make us uncomfortable. Despite official suspicion, churchmen secretly kept almanacs. Some monasteries even recorded lunar phases for planting and fasting. Faith and fortune-telling weren't enemies. They were awkward roommates sharing the same sky. Though the telescope would soon shrink astrology's scientific reputation, its influence never truly vanished. Even today, people blame Mercury's retrograde for tech glitches and bad dates, exactly the kind of cosmic excuse a Tudor would admire. For the people of the 16th century, the stars made life feel connected. When everything else was uncertain, war, plague, weather, the heavens were steady, glittering constants. If the stars were angry, at least they were paying attention. The Tudors didn't read horoscopes for fun, they read them for survival, and probably to find out if Thursday was a good day for soup. To the Tudor mind, your body wasn't just flesh and blood, it was a fragile container barely keeping your soul from leaking out. Everything that left your body, from breath to tears to sneeze residue, was a potential spiritual security breach. In an age obsessed with invisible forces, angels, demons and humours, even the most innocent bodily function could be a cosmic event. The Tudors didn't sneeze without fear, didn't yawn without caution, and definitely didn't hiccup without wondering which spirit had just taken up residence in their diaphragm. The body, to them, was a haunted house that occasionally made alarming noises. In the 1500s, sneezing wasn't just a sneeze. Kundal. It was a moment of spiritual crisis, a violent explosion of life and death in one nasal blast. People believed a sneeze was your soul momentarily escaping your body, leaving you dangerously open to demonic hijacking. Bless you, therefore, wasn't a polite reflex, it was a magical shield, a verbal lasso meant to yank your soul back before something unholy climbed inside. If you sneezed once, it meant good fortune, a friendly little shake from the angels. Sneezing twice was suspicious. 3 times, now you had a problem. Some said it was a sign of sickness, others thought it was a warning that the devil was tickling your nose, just to see if you'd let your soul slip out unattended. In Tudor England, catching a cold was less about germs and more about fending off spiritual identity theft. Yawning was even more alarming. When you opened your mouth wide enough to stretch your jaw, you also, according to Tudor belief, opened a convenient portal for demons. It's why even today people instinctively cover their mouths when yawning. Originally, that wasn't about manners, it was about demon control. Parents warned children never to yawn without crossing themselves. If you forgot, a devil might hop in, make you lazy, or worse, whisper wicked thoughts that made you start questioning whether Lent was really necessary. In a world where temptation was a constant concern, an unguarded yawn was like leaving your front door open with a welcome Lucifer sign. If you yawned in Tudor England, you weren't tired. You were auditioning for demonic possession. Not every bodily reflex got divine attention, but most got some. Hiccups, for instance, were believed to mean that someone was gossiping about you. The cure, hold your breath, make the sign of the cross, and drink ale, which, conveniently was also the Tudor cure for most things. Coughing too much could mean you'd offended a saint, especially if it happened during church. Chronic belching might be caused by swallowing a demon during a meal, which in fairness explained a lot about Tudor cooking. People carried little charms or whispered blessings before meals to make sure no impish creatures slipped in with their bread and beer. A Tudor dinner table sounded less like polite conversation and more like a medieval exorcism. Breath wasn't just oxygen, it was your life essence. God had breathed life into Adam, so every exhale was a miniature recreation of creation. Losing your breath meant losing divine favour. Regaining it meant divine mercy. Doctors, priests and astrologers all agreed that breath connected the body and the soul. That's why prayer, chanting and sighing were considered physically powerful acts. A calm breath meant a balanced soul. A ragged breath meant something or someone was meddling inside you. Midwives were trained to listen closely to a newborn's first breath. It was proof that God had arrived in miniature form. If a baby didn't breathe immediately, it wasn't seen as a medical emergency. It was a theological one. A midwife might blow gently into the baby's mouth while muttering prayers to invite the soul in. In Tudor England, every inhale was theology, and every exhale was a potential crisis. Sneezing during key moments was especially ominous. If you sneezed during a sermon, it meant the devil was nearby. If you sneezed during childbirth, it could doom the baby. If you sneezed while someone was dying, it was seen as the soul's last goodbye, possibly yours. There were even superstitions about directional sneezing. Sneezing to the east brought good luck. Sneezing to the west brought misfortune. No one quite explained how you were supposed to control that, but the Tudors were big on rules that were impossible to follow. Imagine being judged by which direction your nose happened to explode. That's Tudor logic for you. Naturally, the church got involved in regulating all this nasal theology. Priests encouraged the habit of saying God bless you after sneezes, turning what might have been folk magic into holy etiquette. Blessings for coughs and fevers were added to prayer books, and certain saints like Saint Blaise became patron protectors of throats and lungs. Ironically, this blurred the line between medicine and miracle even further. People believed the church could sanctify not just their souls but also their sneezes. A blessed sneeze was a sign of divine favour, an unblessed one was flirting with eternal damnation. If your priest sneezed during Mass, congratulations, you just attended the holiest allergy attack in England. Social rituals grew around these beliefs. People blessed sneezers, apologised for yawning, and tried not to laugh too loudly for fear that too much breath might escape. Even the language reflected it. Words like spirit, inspiration, and expire all traced back to breath, the line between body and soul. The Tudor world was one long balancing act between the sacred and the ridiculous. A sneeze could be divine or dangerous, a hiccup could be gossip, and a yawn could be an open invitation to Satan. The Tudors didn't separate faith from biology. They just called everything weird that happened to their bodies a theological event. Though science eventually dethroned superstition, old habits cling to modern life like stubborn cobwebs. We still say bless you after sneezing, cover our mouths when we yawn, and instinctively fear losing control of our breath when scared. It's a ghost of Tudor anxiety still haunting our manners. For the Tudors, the body wasn't just a machine, it was a battlefield where heaven and hell fought for every exhale. And if you sneezed at the wrong time, heaven might lose the round, bless you. Because in Tudor England, that might have been the only thing standing between you and a full-scale possession. In Tudor England, a mirror wasn't just a shiny surface. It was a mystical object, a shimmering, dangerous window between the world of the living and the world of spirits. To gaze into a mirror was to flirt with the supernatural, and to break one was practically asking the universe to schedule your misery. Reflections, to the Tudor imagination, weren't harmless. They were portals, fragile glass doorways where your soul might accidentally wander out, or something else might wander in. Vanity was dangerous not just morally but cosmically. Every time you admired yourself in the glass, you weren't just checking your hair, you were taking attendance for your soul. Every Tudor mirror was a combination of spiritual hazard and self-esteem crisis. The belief that mirrors held part of your essence came from the ancient notion that the reflection wasn't a trick of light, it was you. When you looked into the glass, your soul looked back. That made mirrors useful for self-knowledge. but terrifying for accidents. Crack the glass, and you didn't just damage your reflection, you damaged the spiritual version of yourself. 7 years of bad luck was the going rate, and that wasn't arbitrary. People believed the soul renewed itself every 7 years. Until then, you were spiritually dented, like a scratched record of existence. Tudors handled mirrors the way we'd handle nuclear reactors, cautiously, reverently, and with absolutely no idea how they actually worked. Breaking a mirror wasn't clumsiness, it was emotional manslaughter. Mirrors weren't just for personal grooming, they were also tools of magic, divination, and according to some, devilish communication. Scrying, or mirror gazing, was a popular occult practice in Tudor England, though officially condemned by the church. Astrologers and magicians, most famously Dr. John Dee, Queen Elizabeth I's court wizard and general celestial enthusiast, used chew stones, polished black mirrors made from obsidian, to communicate with angels or spirits. These mirrors weren't meant for reflection but revelation. Practitioners believed they could glimpse visions, prophecies, and messages from beyond. For ordinary folk, this was thrilling and horrifying. Mirrors could show the truth, but they could also show too much, especially if you weren't ready to see your late grandmother waving back. Ask not what the mirror can do for you, ask whether it comes with an exorcism policy. Tudor households often treated mirrors with more caution than fire. After someone died, families covered mirrors with cloth to stop the deceased soul from getting trapped inside or to prevent it from reappearing. It wasn't just grief, it was ghost prevention. During thunderstorms, mirrors were turned to the wall so lightning wouldn't split the soul. Travellers avoided looking into mirrors at night for fear that spirits were most active after sundown, and that the face looking back might not always be their own. And if a mirror fell by itself, terrible omen. The kind of omen that made people sit down, whisper prayers, and immediately blame the nearest witch. In Tudor England, if your mirror moved on its own, you didn't fix it. You moved. The church had mixed feelings about mirrors. On one hand, they symbolized divine reflection, seeing God's image in humanity. On the other, they were magnets for vanity, pride, and demonic illusions. Religious preachers warned that mirrors tempted the sinful eye. Looking too long wasn't just narcissism, it was opening the door to Satan's selfie mode. The tension between reflection and morality made mirrors double-edged symbols. Artists used them in paintings to represent truth or deceit, purity or pride. A woman gazing into a mirror might represent the sin of vanity or the pursuit of divine understanding. It all depended on who was preaching the sermon. Mirrors were like Tudor celebrities, adored, condemned, and blamed for everyone's moral decay. The most unsettling belief was that mirrors could reveal or even trap the spirits of the dead. Some said the dying saw their reflection fade as their soul departed. Others swore that looking into a mirror during a haunting could show you the ghost that caused it. Superstition held that an unblessed mirror could be used by witches to steal souls or summon demons. People swore that dark figures sometimes appeared behind them in the glass. Never a good sign when your house didn't have visitors. To counteract this, Tudors hung mirrors in sunlight to purify them, or sprinkled holy water across the frame. If the reflection rippled or dimmed, it wasn't an optical illusion, it was a divine red flag. If your reflection blinked when you didn't, congratulations, your mirror came with a tenant. Mirrors in Tudor England were expensive. Polished metal or imported Venetian glass. Owning one was a mark of wealth and education, but it also came with responsibility. People whispered that mirrors absorbed everything they saw, arguments, sins, faces, and held them like memories. Some nobles refused to keep mirrors in bedrooms for fear that sleeping near one left their souls unguarded. The irony? The same aristocrats commissioned portraits surrounded by reflective objects to symbolize intellect and beauty. Vanity, it seemed, was terrifying, but not terrifying enough to skip self-promotion. A Tudor noble might condemn vanity in public, then spend 3 hours privately adjusting his soul in the mirror. Though centuries have passed, traces of Tudor mirror lore linger. We still associate broken mirrors with bad luck. We still cover mirrors during mourning in some cultures. And deep down, even in our age of selfies, there's a faint unease when catching our own reflection in a darkened window. That strange flicker that reminds us the Tudors might not have been entirely wrong. For them, mirrors were dangerous gifts, the ability to see oneself, but never be sure what might be looking back. The Tudors didn't fear the monsters under the bed, They feared the one politely staring back from the mirror. In Tudor England, the home wasn't just a place to sleep and argue about bread rations. It was a fortress in a constant spiritual war. Evil spirits, witches, curses, and the devil himself were believed to wander freely, peeking through windows and crawling through keyholes. Your only defense? A carefully arranged arsenal of household magic, a mix of iron, old footwear, dried herbs, and blind faith nailed into every corner of the building. Every Tudor home, no matter how humble, doubled as a supernatural panic room. Builders didn't just think about structure and airflow, they thought about demons. A well-built Tudor house was one that could withstand both the weather and the apocalypse. A Tudor home didn't need home insurance. It needed a good exorcist and a hammer. Iron was the Tudor world's favourite metal, not just for nails and tools, but for driving away the supernatural. The devil, people said, hated iron. It reminded him of the nails that held Christ to the cross, a bad memory apparently. So iron became the go-to spiritual barrier. The horseshoe was the most famous of these charms. People nailed them above doors, over hearths or near windows to keep witches out and luck in. The open end always had to face upward, like a cup, so the luck wouldn't spill out. If someone hung it the wrong way, neighbours would whisper that they'd just invited disaster, or worse, that they were secretly friends with the devil. Some blacksmiths even blessed the horseshoes before sale. Since blacksmiths worked with fire and iron, both substances demons feared, they were considered halfway between craftsmen and wizards. It wasn't unusual for a villager to ask the smith to speak a prayer into the shoe before hanging it up. The Tudor devil must have hated English villagers. Every door looked like an iron mine of personal rejection. If you've ever renovated an old English house and found a single dusty shoe hidden behind a beam, congratulations. You've discovered Tudor anxiety in physical form. It was common practice to bury shoes in the walls or beneath floorboards as magical protection. Shoes, oddly enough, were thought to hold a person's essence, shaped by their feet, infused with their sweat and life. A worn shoe carried powerful human energy, the kind that could confuse or repel evil spirits. If a witch or demon tried to enter, the lingering human imprint inside the shoe would trick them, like a ghostly decoy. It sounds absurd, but archaeological studies have uncovered hundreds of these shoes hidden in Tudor-era buildings, sometimes with children's shoes placed near chimneys or doorways to guard the family. It wasn't just symbolic, it was deeply emotional. A parent hiding their child's shoe in the wall wasn't just following superstition, they were building love into the house, one terrified precaution at a time. Modern houses have smoke alarms. Tudor houses had footwear surveillance. Not all Tudor home protection was subtle. For those who feared targeted witchcraft, there was the witch bottle, a truly charming decoration consisting of a glass or earthenware jar filled with urine, nails, hair and pins. The logic was that if a witch cursed you, the bottle would absorb the spell's energy. When heated or buried, the pins and bodily fluids inside would torment the witch until she stopped. It was grim, smelly, and oddly personal, half magic, half revenge fantasy. People buried these bottles beneath doorsteps or hearths, creating a kind of supernatural landmine for unwanted visitors. Even soldiers in the later 16th century carried smaller versions for protection on campaigns. The Tudor imagination saw the home not as a peaceful retreat, but as a battlefield, one that needed both architectural integrity and good plumbing for curses. If your Tudor neighbour was burying bottles of pee and pins under his house, that wasn't madness, that was pest control. The entry points of a Tudor home were considered its weak spots, literal openings where spirits could sneak in. Chimneys were especially dangerous. They connected fire wholly to air unclean, and everyone knew witches preferred vertical entrances. To protect these vulnerable areas, Tudors placed charms inside walls, under thresholds, and in roof spaces. Dead cats were sometimes sealed into walls as spirit guardians, because nothing says cosy family home like a mummified feline bricked above the fireplace. Builders even scratched protective symbols, circles, pentagrams, or intersecting lines known as daisy wheels, into beams to trap wandering demons in endless loops. Every nail, every beam, every corner had meaning. To build a Tudor house was to construct a magical ecosystem. Your average Tudor carpenter was basically half builder, half amateur ghost hunter. At the heart of the home was the hearth, literally and spiritually. The fire symbolized life, warmth, and divine presence. It was kept burning not just for comfort but for protection. Letting it go out overnight was risky. It meant leaving the family unguarded. People often placed iron tongs crossed above the fire or tucked tiny relics, a saint's medal, a blessed coin into the hearth's brickwork. Ashes were never thrown out after sunset, in case someone's spirit followed them. The Tudor fireplace wasn't just a cooking spot, it was a glowing altar where faith and fear flickered together. The Tudor hearth wasn't just for roasting meat, it was also for roasting demons. All these rituals, the shoes, the bottles, the symbols, weren't mere superstition, they were psychological architecture. When the world outside was unpredictable, full of plague and politics, people made their homes the one place they could control. To the Tudors, evil didn't belong in fairy tales, it lived next door. So they responded, the only way they knew how, by fortifying every doorway with iron, leather, prayer, and hope. Each house was both fortress and confession, proof that fear was universal and that survival was as much about imagination as faith. The Tudors didn't just build homes, they built anxiety bunkers with decorative beams. Today, historians still find these tokens, shoes, bottles, cat skeletons, etched circles, hidden deep within centuries-old homes. We call them superstition, they call them security. And if you ever feel a sudden chill in an old English cottage, don't worry, it's probably just a 16th century pair of shoes still doing its job. The good news? Your house is protected. The bad news? It's by someone's left boot from 1583. In Tudor England, dinner wasn't just nourishment, it was a daily ritual of hope, fear, and mild witchcraft. Every meal, from peasant porridge to noble banquets, came with a side serving of superstition. People didn't just eat to live, they ate to survive invisible forces that apparently had very strong opinions about table manners. The Tudors believed that food could predict the future, reveal death, attract luck, or offend God, sometimes all at once. You couldn't even crack an egg without wondering whether you just triggered divine approval or the apocalypse. In Tudor kitchens, the recipe book was half cookbook, half exorcism manual. Eggs, simple as they seem, were seen as mystical capsules of life and bad omens waiting to happen. The way an egg cracked, cooked, or even floated in water was read like a horoscope. If an egg cracked too cleanly, good fortune awaited. If it shattered oddly, something bad was on the horizon, like your neighbour's cow dying or your roof caving in. Eggshells were never tossed carelessly. Destroying them completely was essential, lest witches collect them to sail the seas in tiny magical boats and cause storms. Yes, really, witches in eggshells were considered a legitimate maritime hazard. Sailors demanded that women burn their breakfast shells before travelling. Eggs could even forecast the weather. Drop one into water, and if it sank, rain was coming. If it floated, fair skies. If it exploded, well, someone had probably cursed your pantry. A Tudor sailor didn't fear the ocean, he feared a witch in an omelette. Bread was the soul of Tudor life. Literally, bakers prayed over their dough, crossed their loaves before baking, and watched the rising process with priestly reverence. A loaf that failed to rise wasn't just a culinary failure, it was a spiritual red flag. The bubbles in the crust, called blisters, were ominous signs. A single large bubble might foretell death in the household. Multiple small ones could mean gossip or scandal, and if a loaf split open too wide, it was said to weep for sin. Bakers didn't just need flour, they needed fate. Breaking bread also carried sacred rules. Dropping it on the floor was an insult to God. Throwing crumbs away was wasteful and unlucky. Crumbs might be blessed by Christ's body after all. Some families kept stale bread as protection charms, believing that its holiness lingered longer than its flavour. A Tudor baker didn't fear hunger, he feared a loaf with opinions. Salt wasn't just seasoning, it was spiritual insurance. It purified, preserved, and protected. A pinch of salt could drive away the devil, bless a newborn, or seal a contract. It was also absurdly expensive, which only made it more magical. To spill salt was catastrophic, a sure omen of betrayal or disaster. The proper response: immediately throw a pinch over your left shoulder to blind the devil waiting there. Why the left? Because evil, much like bad handwriting, was thought to favour that side. At Tudor tables, the salt dish sat at the centre like a sacred relic. The phrase above the salt meant high social rank. Those seated near the salt cellar were noble. Those below it were commoners. Salt didn't just flavour your food, it decided your place in the social hierarchy. In Tudor dining, you didn't just mind your manners, you minded your salt radius. Meals doubled as fortune-telling sessions. If your spoon fell, a visitor was coming. If your knife fell, trouble. If both fell, it was time to start confessing your sins. A dropped fork was even worse. A woman would bring bad luck into the house before the week was out. Sitting 13 at a table was unthinkable, a cursed echo of the Last Supper. Cutting both ends off a loaf before slicing, that released the devil inside. Bread baked unevenly meant someone in the village was pregnant. And if your ale foamed over unexpectedly, it wasn't poor brewing, it was a ghost joining the party. Even eating too quickly could invite sickness, because the devil sits on haste. The Tudors believed food should be eaten thoughtfully, ideally with a few prayers in between bites, which might explain why meals lasted hours. Every Tudor dinner came with calories, cholesterol, and a light sense of impending doom. Some foods were blessed by association. Pancakes, for example, were eaten on Shrove Tuesday to cleanse the household of fat before Lent. Eating fish on Fridays wasn't just religious duty, it was divine pest control, keeping your soul in good standing. Milk had to be guarded from witches who supposedly skimmed cream by magic. To stop them, families stirred milk clockwise and muttered rhymes like, "Hands off my cream, foul fiend unseen." Cheese, oddly enough, was believed to absorb the essence of the moon during its making, hence eating it too late at night risked disturbing dreams. Certain combinations were forbidden. Eggs and fish invited storms. Bread and apples together could cool the stomach too much, possibly fatally. The Tudor stomach was considered a delicate battleground of elements and spirits, easily offended by poor menu planning. The Tudor diet wasn't about losing weight, it was about avoiding divine punishment. Before eating, the host always blessed the meal. During dinner, no one crossed knives on the table. That symbolized conflict. No one licked knives either. That was how accidents and curses happened. Cutting bread with the same knife used for meat was dangerous, since it mixed sacred grain with sinful flesh. When the meal ended, leftovers weren't thrown out but burned or buried. Food, even scraps, had spiritual residue. Throwing it away carelessly could insult the saints or attract wandering souls looking for a midnight snack. In Tudor England, your leftovers didn't go to waste. They went to heaven, eventually. Today, a kitchen is where we cook. For the Tudors, it was where they negotiated with the universe. Every ladle and loaf carried a lesson. Respect your food, fear your salt, and never underestimate an egg. Theirs was a world where the divine and domestic mixed freely, where God could live in your bread and the devil could hide in your soup. And through it all, the Tudor cook stirred carefully, whispering prayers between recipes, just in case the porridge was listening. The Tudors didn't dine for pleasure, they dined to stay on speaking terms with fate. If you lived in Tudor England and woke up with a fever, congratulations. Your chances of survival depended on how much you believed in magic, how much money you had, and how desperate your doctor felt that morning. Medicine in the 16th century was a glorious cocktail of theology, guesswork, and open-air superstition, sprinkled with the occasional frog. The Tudor body was a mystery, part divine machine, part demon magnet. Illness wasn't caused by bacteria, it was caused by imbalances, evil vapours, or sometimes just God's boredom. To get better, you didn't fight infection, you negotiated with it. The result was a medical system where science and sorcery sat in the same waiting room. Tudor medicine didn't cure you, it distracted you until either you or the disease gave up. At the heart of Tudor medicine was the ancient Greek idea of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These weren't just fluids, they were your personality, your health, and your destiny in liquid form. Every illness, from plague to heartbreak, came down to one thing: your humours were having a bad day. Too much blood made you brave, but feverish. Too much phlegm made you sluggish. Too much bile made you angry. Too much of anything meant someone was probably about to start cutting you open with a dull knife. Balancing these humours required heroic effort and horrifying methods. Bloodletting was the most popular. opening a vein and draining your excess vitality into a bowl, often while reciting prayers. Some physicians even had charts showing which body parts corresponded to which zodiac signs, because naturally, Mars ruled your spleen, and the moon had opinions about your kidneys. The Tudor cure for weakness was to remove more blood, the medical equivalent of fixing hunger by throwing away your lunch. Doctors were few, expensive, and frequently wrong. Most towns instead had barber surgeons, men who cut hair, drained blood, set bones, and pulled teeth, all with the same tools and possibly the same hand towel. But you needed surgery, you didn't go to a sterile room, you went to a barber's stall. Your anaesthetic options were ale, screaming, or passing out, and yet people trusted these men because at least they looked professional while sawing your arm off. Even more respected were apothecaries, who sold potions, powders, and questionable mixtures that claimed to cure anything. Their shops smelled like a mix of heaven and horror, shelves lined with dried herbs, preserved snakes, ground gemstones, and jars of who knows what. If it didn't work, it was because your faith wasn't strong enough. Apothecaries, where customer satisfaction was measured by whether you still had a pulse. During outbreaks of plague, people became walking experiments in desperation. One common remedy was to wear a live frog in a small cloth bag around your neck. The frog was supposed to absorb the disease, leaving you pure and plague-free. When the frog died, that was considered proof it had worked, though your continued coughing might have suggested otherwise. Toads were also prized. A dried toad hung in a pouch under the armpit was said to draw out fevers. For those short on frogs, you could always carry a spider sealed inside a walnut shell. The key was commitment, not necessarily intelligence. In Tudor medicine, nothing said get well soon like a dead amphibian necklace. When frogs didn't do the trick, Tudors turned to more human solutions. Mummy powder, made from ground-up embalmed corpses imported from Egypt, was a best-selling cure-all. Apothecaries sold it in fine brown dust, advertising it as medicine, infused with the vital spirit of life. If Egyptian mummies were too pricey, local options existed. Powdered skulls from freshly executed criminals were used for headaches and epilepsy. Patients drank them mixed with wine because apparently decency was optional if your temples hurt. Physicians justified it through logic. The skull once held the mind, so consuming it might restore reason. By that logic, a full head of ground-up philosopher should have made you a genius. Some people took aspirin. The Tudors took Hamlet. There were cures for everything, and none of them made sense. For jaundice, eat baked pigeon dung. For toothache, kiss a donkey. For the plague, hold a posy of herbs under your nose and pray the smell distracted death himself. Sweating cures were especially popular. People locked themselves in steam rooms with burning herbs, emerging red, dizzy, and certain they were healed, mostly because they couldn't feel their legs anymore. Some remedies bordered on performance art. A famous cure for warts involved rubbing them with bacon and burying the meat under the moon. When the bacon rotted away, so would the wart. It's unclear whether this worked, but it definitely kept neighbourhood dogs entertained. If Tudor doctors couldn't heal you, they could at least season you. Despite the chaos, medicine was deeply spiritual. Illness was punishment for sin, and healing required prayer as much as poultices. Monks brewed herbal tonics in cloisters. Parish priests blessed wounds. Even secular healers recited psalms while mixing potions. The border between doctor and priest was about as thin as the patient's pulse. The wealthy paid for astrological medicine, where physicians consulted the stars before prescribing leeches. Poorer folk just hoped their healer remembered which end of the knife was the sharp one. Either way, recovery was often credited to divine mercy rather than human skill. If you survived Tudor medicine, it was considered a miracle, mainly because it probably was. Modern medicine owes much to this era, not for its effectiveness, but for its enthusiasm. The Tudors laid the groundwork for empirical study, simply by trying everything. Their courage and their patients' poor judgment pushed knowledge forward one leech at a time. They lived in a world where every cough could mean a curse, and every cure could double as a nightmare. But through faith, trial, and many unfortunate frogs, they kept humanity stumbling and occasionally limping toward progress. The Tudors walked so modern doctors could run, preferably away from anything involving powdered skulls. In Tudor England, the weather wasn't just weather, it was a message. Every gust of wind, every drop of rain, every clap of thunder carried a hidden divine memo. Was God pleased? Was he furious? Or had the local witch been practicing again? In an age before meteorology, people didn't check forecasts, they checked their conscience. The Tudor farmer didn't see clouds forming, he saw judgment gathering. A drought wasn't a climate pattern, it was punishment for sin. A flood wasn't coincidence, it was divine rage. Nature to them was not indifferent, it was personal, emotional, and prone to tantrums. The Tudors didn't say bad weather, they said God's in a mood again. When the skies opened up, people didn't reach for umbrellas, they reached for priests. Heavy storms were read as direct expressions of God's displeasure. If lightning struck a church spire, that wasn't physics, it was divine punctuation. If hail destroyed your crops, someone had sinned, and it was your job to find out who. Floods, fires, and famine were the holy trinity of divine punishment. Entire villages gathered to confess sins during droughts, walking barefoot through fields in processions known as Rogasane days. Priests sprinkled holy water on crops while chanting Latin, hoping to remind heaven that England was still worth watering. When the rain finally came, it was hailed as a miracle. If it came too much, it was another test of faith. In short, God was a notoriously unpredictable weatherman. But in Tudor England, divine mercy and divine trolling looked suspiciously alike. Of course, not all bad weather came from God, at least not directly. Many Tudors believed witches could summon storms. These weather witches were feared across Europe, accused of wrecking ships, drowning harvests, and ruining laundry days with malicious precision. In 1589, long after Henry VIII's reign, but still firmly in Tudor imagination, witchcraft trials erupted in Scotland when King James VI, later James I of England, blamed witches for conjuring storms that nearly sank his fleet. The story spread like wildfire, and soon English villagers were blaming every thunderclap on some suspicious old woman with a cat. Hotgrah. Witches were said to boil toads, chant curses into the wind, or toss hair into running water to bind the skies. Fishermen swore they saw women muttering on cliffs before gales hit the coast. Farmers claimed witches could milk clouds the way they milked cows, squeezing the sky for rain. In Tudor England, meteorology had no satellites, just grandmas with bad reputations. Agriculture ruled Tudor life, which meant weather ruled everything else. A good harvest meant joy and beer. A bad one meant famine and panic. Since the concept of climate systems didn't exist, someone had to take the blame when nature misbehaved. Too much rain? Clearly a curse. Too little? Definitely a curse. Wind blew the wrong way? Someone was dabbling with spirits again. It was practically community policy to locate a scapegoat before the mud dried. Villagers carried out rituals to heal the land. Ploughs were blessed, fields were sprinkled with milk, and candles were burned in barns to warm the wheat's soul. Some farmers even buried pieces of bread or salted meat at the edges of their fields to feed the earth and encourage its generosity. A Tudor farmer didn't irrigate his crops, he negotiated with them. Thunderstorms were the ultimate supernatural spectacle. People believed thunder was either angels bowling, a surprisingly cheerful theory, or demons beating drums in celebration of sin. Lightning, meanwhile, was God's spear, or sometimes the devil's whip. When a storm hit, families rushed to extinguish candles, close shutters, and kneel in prayer. Church bells were rung during storms to frighten away demons, but ironically, bell towers were magnets for lightning. Many a pious bell ringer met a dramatic end while defending the village from Satan's weather. Afterwards, survivors collected thunderstones, smooth, flint-like rocks thought to have fallen from the sky, as charms against future storms. In truth, they were ancient fossils or arrowheads, but to Tudors, they were holy relics forged by thunder itself. The Tudors couldn't explain lightning, but they were confident it hated sinners and roof beams equally. Drought was just as terrifying as floods. When rivers dried up and crops failed, people didn't write to Parliament. They organised fasting feasts, where everyone gathered to not eat in hopes of convincing God to make it rain. Irony was not lost on them, they just called it faith. Wells were blessed by priests, and processions carried crucifixes through parched villages. Sometimes, statues of saints were physically dunked into dry ponds as a spiritual hint. Saint Swithin, if you want to come out, bring rain. It sounds absurd, but to the Tudors, divine persuasion was a perfectly legitimate agricultural strategy. When it hadn't rained in weeks, you didn't pray for clouds. You threatened saints with waterboarding. The Tudor world didn't separate the natural from the divine. Earthquakes, eclipses, comets and hailstorms were all seen as messages. A comet could foretell the death of a king. A mild winter meant God was merciful. A particularly loud thunderclap might mean someone nearby had angered heaven, possibly by skipping church or sneezing too proudly. Even animals joined in as meteorological messengers. Crows circling a church meant rain. Frogs croaking too early meant plague. If your dog howled during a storm, it wasn't afraid of thunder, it was warning of the dead. To the Tudors, the sky was alive, a moody, magnificent creature watching humanity with unpredictable interest. Modern people check the weather app. The Tudors checked if the cow looked nervous, though we now blame pressure systems instead of witches. The ghost of Tudor weather superstition lingers. We still talk about acts of God, still knock on wood when skies darken, and still grumble like medieval peasants when it rains on holidays. For the Tudors, the weather was never random. It was a mirror of their morality, a living sermon written in clouds and thunder. And while science has replaced the saints and the scapegoats, one thing hasn't changed. When the storm rolls in, everyone still looks up and says, "Why me?" The Tudors feared witches for the rain, we just blame the forecast. Progress, but only just. In Tudor England, childbirth wasn't a happy pastel-coloured moment. It was a survival event. Every new baby was a small miracle wrapped in danger, superstition, and damp linen. The process was equal parts medical emergency, spiritual trial, and community performance, with midwives acting as both nurses and battlefield generals. The stakes couldn't have been higher. One wrong prayer, one unlucky sneeze, or one witchy midwife could turn a joyous birth into a supernatural crisis. It wasn't just about bringing life into the world, it was about beating back death long enough to give the child a fighting chance. Tudor labour didn't need epidurals, it needed divine intervention, and maybe a sword. Midwives were the queens of the birthing chamber, respected, feared, and frequently accused of witchcraft. They were the only medical authority most women ever saw, blending practical knowledge with spiritual caution. A good midwife knew herbs, charms, and prayers. A bad one was whispered to be in league with the devil, usually by neighbours who didn't like her cat. These women carried a terrifying amount of power in a society where women were supposed to have none. They could decide whether to baptise a dying baby, a crucial spiritual privilege. They gave advice on marriage and fertility, and they often knew everyone's secrets because they literally delivered them. If a child was born deformed, stillborn, or simply fussy, the midwife was sometimes blamed for touching it wrong or inviting spirits. In witch trials, many accused women were former midwives, victims of their own expertise. Help a mother give birth, get called a hero. Help 5, get called a witch. The birthing chamber wasn't just a room, it was a spiritual bunker. Windows were covered, mirrors turned to the wall, and all doors were locked to keep evil spirits from sneaking in. Crosses were hung above the bed, and candles blessed by a priest flickered beside bowls of holy water and herbs. No men were allowed inside. This was a sacred, female domain. The only male presence permitted was the priest. If things turned grim, women in labour were surrounded by friends, neighbours, and older women chanting encouragement, prayers, and occasionally threats directed at the unborn child to come out and behave. The air was thick with ritual. Midwives murmured charms for an easy birth, often mixing them with practical commands: breathe, push, and don't curse the saints. A Tudor birth wasn't silent suffering, it was a full-scale musical number featuring shouting, sweating, and divine cameos. Superstition was as essential as boiling water. Pregnant women carried birthing charms, small bags filled with holy relics, verses from psalms, or even bits of bone from saintly remains. The most famous charm was a parchment known as the girdle of childbirth, a scroll of prayers and blessings wrapped around the mother's waist during labour, to protect her and the baby. Priests blessed the parchment before the birth, and the mother wore it like armour. For extra luck, midwives placed bread and salt beneath the bed, symbols of life and purity, to repel demons. If the labour dragged on, someone might recite the genealogy of Christ aloud, not for drama, but because listing 42 generations of holy lineage was said to make the devil lose interest. When contractions started, so did the reading list. Nothing terrifies evil like a long family tree. Timing was everything. A baby born at dawn was blessed. A baby born at midnight risked being moon-touched, destined for mischief or witchcraft. Tuesday births promised strength. Friday births foretold sorrow. The baby's first cry was a moment of triumph, proof that the soul had successfully entered the body. If the baby didn't cry, panic followed. The midwife might rub its chest with salt, blow into its mouth, or even hold it near the fire to warm the soul inside. If nothing worked, a priest was summoned for an emergency baptism, because an unbaptized child, if it died, risked wandering purgatory forever. In Tudor England, your first breath was celebrated. Your second was just relief. Once the baby was safe, the mother entered a period of churching, a 40-day ritual of purification before she could rejoin society. Birth was seen as holy, but also sinful, since it came from Eve's original disobedience. Until she was churched, the mother was considered spiritually unclean, and in some places even dangerous to crops or milk. The ceremony involved the mother kneeling in church, being blessed by a priest, and giving thanks for survival. Only after that could she gossip freely again or attend feasts without being subtly avoided. For the baby, protection continued non-stop. A cross was drawn on its forehead with oil or wine. Amulets were pinned to its clothing. The cradle might be lined with rosemary or garlic to keep witches away. A baby without a charm was practically an open invitation for trouble. Newborn care: feed, swaddle, and demon-proof daily. If the mother or child died, it wasn't just tragedy, it was cosmic failure. Families sought reasons immediately. Was the midwife cursed? Did someone forget to pray? Did the father offend a saint? Death during childbirth was heartbreakingly common, but superstition offered the only comfort. It gave grief an explanation. Stillborn babies were quietly baptized with holy water or river water, sometimes in secret, to ensure their souls reached heaven. Even tragedy was ritualized, because every Tudor believed that life and death were threads in the same divine web. The Tudors didn't believe in medical malpractice, they believed in cosmic customer service. Tudor childbirth blended courage and chaos. Women relied on each other, on faith, and on centuries of inherited wisdom, some practical, some absolutely unhinged. Every mother was a survivor. Every baby was a victory. Though we've traded charms for hospitals, echoes of Tudor superstition linger. Baby showers as blessings, lullabies as protective chants, baptism as spiritual armor. The tools have changed, but the instinct to shield new life from the unknown remains as ancient as ever. 500 years later, parents still fear demons. They just call them sleep regression. In Tudor England, love was never just about chemistry, unless you count the kind brewed in a cauldron. Courtship was an unpredictable mix of piety, folklore, and creative manipulation. You didn't fall in love so much as engineer it, often with the help of charms, potions, and whatever bits of anatomy you could discreetly acquire. To modern eyes, Tudor romance looks equal parts romantic comedy and crime scene investigation. A lock of hair here, a vial of bodily fluid there, and suddenly you weren't flirting, you were performing folk magic. Tudor dating advice: if they like you, it's fate. If they don't, it's probably witchcraft. Marriage wasn't just about affection. It was economics, politics, and survival, all dressed up in lace. For the rich, unions were contracts between families. For the poor, they were partnerships for keeping a roof over one's head. Love was a pleasant bonus, but no one relied on it showing up naturally. Hence the booming trade in love charms. From village healers to wandering peddlers, you could buy powders, knots, or prayers guaranteed to stir the heart of your beloved. The line between sincere devotion and sorcery was thin. Reciting a psalm might be holy, but whisper it 3 times over a cup of ale, and you were dabbling in enchantment. Cupid may have had arrows, but the Tudors had arsenic and persistence. Love knots were the Tudor equivalent of relationship status updates. A woman might twist a ribbon into a specific pattern while murmuring a lover's name, then hide it under a pillow to summon dreams of him. If he appeared smiling, the match was blessed. If he appeared frowning, or worse, with another woman, it was time to switch knots or suitors. Others tied binding charms, threads or cords that symbolically tied 2 souls together. Some were simple: red string for passion, blue for loyalty. Others got creative: braiding hair from both lovers into a cord and burying it beneath a threshold to bind their paths forever, which admittedly sounds more like a horror ritual than a meet-cute. Nothing says eternal love like burying part of your hair in the yard. Potion making was where things got properly weird. Recipes blended astrology, folklore and desperation in equal measure. A popular Tudor aphrodisiac combined wine, honey, cinnamon and powdered sparrow brains, proof that desire and dignity rarely mix well. Women seeking to attract a man might sprinkle love powder into his drink, usually containing crushed herbs like vervain or rosemary. Men, meanwhile, were advised to carry bits of their beloved's hair close to their heart, or, in more adventurous circles, drink a concoction involving her nail clippings. The logic was simple. If love came from the heart, then consuming a piece of your beloved was a shortcut to devotion. It's unclear whether it worked, though it definitely worked as a conversation stopper. If your Tudor sweetheart offered you wine that smelled faintly of fingernails, that wasn't vintage, it was vengeance. Love didn't end with courtship, it just got more complicated. Weddings themselves were drenched in ritual. Rings were exchanged not only as symbols of faithfulness but as talismans of protection. Iron rings guarded against curses, silver ones ensured fertility. Brides wore herbs in their hair, rosemary for remembrance, thyme for courage, and rue for protection from witchcraft. During the ceremony, spilling wine or stumbling was seen as a bad omen, while sneezing was oddly good luck, possibly because the bride's soul hadn't escaped. The wedding bed was another matter entirely. Newlyweds often slept with charms under the sheets, a sprig of ivy for lasting love, a piece of bread for fertility, or even a small iron nail to ward off mischief. And yes, midwives sometimes blessed the bed itself, just in case lust got confused with demonic enthusiasm. In Tudor marriage, romance was fragile, so they nailed it to the mattress for safety. The church naturally hated all of this. Clergy railed against unholy enchantments that tampered with the human will, though even priests quietly admitted that prayer and love charms often looked suspiciously alike. The difference, as usual, depended on who got caught. Still, love magic wasn't just about lust, it was about power. Women, especially, used it as one of the few socially acceptable ways to influence their fates. A well-timed charm could secure a husband, restore affection, or protect against betrayal. In a world where divorce didn't exist and free will was a theological minefield, a bit of herbal persuasion felt downright practical. In Tudor England, a love spell was less about romance and more about career strategy. But love charms could quickly backfire. A jealous rival might accuse someone of using unnatural means to attract affection, and what began as courtship could end as a witch trial. Several Tudor women were tried not for hexing enemies, but for making men fall in love, a crime that, ironically, still sounds suspicious to this day. The boundary between magic and manipulation was paper-thin. If your husband was faithful, you were blessed. If he strayed, you were probably cursed. If he suddenly came back too devoted, well, people started asking uncomfortable questions about your pantry ingredients. Nothing terrified a Tudor husband more than realizing his dinner tasted like parsley and witchcraft. For all its absurdity, Tudor love magic revealed something deeply human, the need to control what can't be controlled. Whether through charms, prayers, or potions that probably violated several modern health codes, people tried to guarantee affection in a world that offered few certainties. We might laugh at their methods, but we still chase luck in love today, just with dating apps instead of dried herbs. The difference is technology. The desperation is timeless. The Tudors used charms, we use algorithms. Either way, nobody's sure why it worked. In Tudor England, death wasn't an event. It was a lifelong obsession. You could be perfectly healthy in the morning and dead by supper, courtesy of the plague, bad water, or an overly confident barber surgeon. Every cough sounded like destiny, every dark cloud looked like foreshadowing, and every crow was basically a tax reminder from God. The Tudors lived shoulder to shoulder with mortality. Funerals, tombs, and ghost stories weren't morbid entertainment. They were daily conversation. The afterlife wasn't distant. It was next door, and sometimes it knocked. In Tudor England, death wasn't the end. It was just the start of your haunting career. The Tudors saw signs of death everywhere. Often literally, a candle that guttered unexpectedly. Someone in the family would die. a dog howling at midnight, the soul of the dying was wandering nearby, a mirror falling off the wall, an owl hooting thrice, or a sudden chill in a warm room, all clear signals that the Reaper had started penciling in appointments. Crows, ravens, and black cats were walking warnings, each believed to carry whispers from the dead. Even bread could be a messenger. If a loaf cracked oddly in the oven, or turned mouldy too soon, it meant a funeral was coming. And let's not forget the death watch beetle, a small insect whose tapping sound was thought to mimic the ticking of time left to live. The Tudors didn't have clocks in every room, but they had beetles, and apparently those worked just as well. If a Tudor home creaked at night, it wasn't the wind, it was your life expectancy dropping by Thursday. Because death was unavoidable, the Tudors tried to perfect it. Manuals called Ars Moriendi, the art of dying, offered advice on how to meet death gracefully and ideally without screaming. A good death meant dying in your bed surrounded by witnesses who could vouch for your repentance and ensure you didn't curse anyone on the way out. People practiced death rehearsals, imagining their final words and arranging their possessions just so. The dying were expected to make peace with everyone, even their enemies, though conveniently, some waited until the very last minute, when apologies couldn't be argued with. If you were poor, your neighbours gathered to pray beside you. If you were rich, your deathbed looked like a royal event. Candles, priests, tapestries, and relatives silently calculating inheritance. The Tudors treated dying like a performance. Everyone wanted good lighting and an audience. Funerals were both spiritual and theatrical. Bells rang to announce your passing, not out of respect, but to scare away demons eager to snatch your soul mid-transit. The body was washed, wrapped in linen, and sprinkled with holy water. Mourners wore black or sometimes deep blue, the colour of grief, and covered mirrors so the deceased spirit wouldn't get stuck staring at itself. Candles were placed around the coffin to light the soul's journey, and professional mourners might wail dramatically for effect. For wealthier Tudors, funerals were social events. There were embroidered banners, processions through town, and enough incense to fumigate a cathedral. And the food, funeral feasts were expected, a comforting spread of ale, bread and meat pies to celebrate that you, at least, weren't the one in the coffin. A Tudor funeral was equal parts tragedy, theatre and catering opportunity. Officially, the church taught that the soul went to heaven or hell, with purgatory in between. Unofficially, most people thought it went wandering first, checking on relatives, haunting old houses, or just being nosy. Prayers for the dead were big business. Families paid priests to say masses for departed souls, hoping to speed their journey through purgatory. In some parishes, you could even subscribe to a chantry, a sort of eternal prayer plan to keep your name on heaven's waiting list. The Reformation later tried to abolish all this. No purgatory, no masses for souls, no indulgences, but people didn't change overnight. Even after official doctrine shifted, villagers still lit candles for Grandma's ghost and muttered that she'd not yet settled. The Tudors couldn't decide if purgatory was real, but they weren't taking any chances. Ghosts were more than bedtime stories. They were considered unfinished business with legs. Spirits appeared to warn of danger, demand justice, or remind the living to pray. Seeing one was terrifying, but ignoring one was worse. People believed ghosts could appear in dreams, reflections, or even inside churchyards, pacing between gravestones until properly prayed for. Exorcisms were performed not just on the living, but on houses. Priests blessed walls, floors, and occasionally suspicious furniture to dislodge the lingering. Haunted places were treated like spiritual quarantines. No one wanted to buy property with an angry soul in residence. Though, curiously, the presence of a ghost sometimes increased a building's prestige. If your manor had a resident spectre, it meant your ancestors had enough unresolved issues to be interesting. In Tudor real estate, a ghost wasn't a problem, it was a feature. Burial customs were riddled with ritual. Graves faced east so souls could rise toward the sunrise on Judgment Day. People buried coins with the dead to pay for the soul's journey, a hangover from pagan tradition that priests conveniently overlooked. It was bad luck to carry a body out of a house feet first. The soul might forget its way to heaven and wander back. Mourners had to walk in silence lest their words called death's attention to new targets. And after the burial, earth from the grave was sprinkled around the house to close the circle of death. Tudor funerals were basically DIY ghost management. The Tudors accepted death as part of daily life, but they refused to face it without ceremony. They dressed grief in colour, wrapped fear in prayer, and made mortality feel almost domestic. For them, the line between the living and the dead was thin, a shared table where one side just happened to be quieter. To a Tudor, dying wasn't the end, it was just moving to a slightly less social neighbourhood. In Tudor England, falling asleep was not the peaceful escape we imagine today. It was spiritual Russian roulette. Once you closed your eyes, you entered a realm where nightmares were real. Sleep paralysis meant demonic assault, and beds were the front lines of unseen warfare. The Tudors saw sleep as dangerous territory, a liminal state between life and death, body and soul. To sleep was to leave yourself vulnerable, a temporary corpse awaiting divine mercy. You might wake refreshed, or you might wake screaming. If you woke at all, to a Tudor, sleeping wasn't rest, it was a nightly audition for the afterlife. The terror of the Tudor night was the nightmare, a demonic spirit that crept into rooms and pressed on sleepers' chests, leaving them paralysed, gasping, and too terrified to scream. These mares weren't the friendly horses of fairy tales. The word nightmare literally came from this creature, the Mara, an invisible being that rode you in your sleep. Victims described waking to find a crushing weight on their chest, unable to move or cry out while shadows seemed to flicker around the bed. Today we call it sleep paralysis. The Tudors called it the devil's visitation. They truly believed the mare spirit was a real entity, a small malicious demon or sometimes the wandering soul of a jealous woman. It could slip through keyholes, cling to rafters and attack the sleeping. The worst part, it always knew your name. Tudor tip: for better sleep, block your keyholes, salt your windowsills, and don't anger anyone named Brendan. Darkness terrified the Tudors. With no streetlights, no electricity, and plenty of superstition, the night was practically Satan's shift. People believed demons were most active after midnight, prowling for sinners, dreamers, and anyone foolish enough to sleep without prayer. Before bed, it was essential to arm the soul. Families recited the white paternoster prayer, crossed themselves, and whispered charms to keep the night spirits at bay. Candles were blessed and snuffed carefully. Blowing one out too quickly might invite darkness in. Beds were placed away from doors and windows, not just for drafts but for ghosts. Some people even slept with iron scissors under the pillow, blades open, a classic Tudor anti-demon defense mechanism, because nothing says sweet dreams like sleeping on cutlery. In Tudor bedrooms, bedtime prep was half ritual, half home security system. Dreams were another matter, mysterious, vivid, and endlessly debated. Were they visions from God, warnings from the devil, or just indigestion? Physicians claimed dreams were caused by vapours of the stomach rising to the brain, meaning a heavy supper could summon apocalyptic visions. The clergy, however, preferred a more spiritual explanation. Holy dreams were divine messages, unholy ones were demonic illusions meant to tempt or terrify. A dream of flying signalled witchcraft, a dream of falling meant pride. Dreaming of water could foretell death, dreaming of teeth falling out meant betrayal. And if you dreamed of pigs, obviously sin. Some people kept dream books, crude manuals that claimed to decode nightly visions. These were banned by the church for encouraging idle prophecy, but that only made them more popular. The Tudors didn't need therapists. They had stomach vapours and apocalyptic pigs. When night terrors struck, the blame usually landed on witches. It was widely believed that witches could send their spirits to ride sleeping victims, the spiritual equivalent of remote harassment. Victims often described waking with bruises or scratches, which they claimed came from invisible tormentors. If livestock died or milk soured afterward, that clinched it. Witchcraft. In some cases, people even accused specific neighbours of being responsible for their sleepless nights. It was a risky business. One bad dream, and your elderly neighbour might find herself on trial. If you woke up tired in Tudor England, you didn't blame insomnia, you blamed Deborah next door. Because the night was so perilous, bedtime rituals bordered on magical choreography. A bowl of salt near the bed, a cross drawn on the sheets, and a candle burned down just enough to light the angel's path. Children were taught to recite rhymes before sleep. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Bless the bed that I lie on. 4 corners to my bed, 4 angels round my head. This wasn't just cute, it was insurance. Forget to say it and the mare spirit might take it personally. Pregnant women, the sick and the elderly were considered especially vulnerable, so charms were placed above their heads. Sprigs of rosemary, scraps of holy text, even small iron nails wrapped in ribbon. If you couldn't afford relics, you could always improvise with a spoon. A Tudor bed wasn't for comfort, it was a weaponized sleep zone. Sleep and death were disturbingly similar to Tudor eyes. Both involved stillness, silence, and the possibility of not waking up. In fact, people sometimes feared being mistaken for dead and buried alive. This led to the practice of keeping vigil over bodies for several nights before burial, just in case they sat up and asked for breakfast. Dreams of dead relatives were also unsettling. The Tudors believed such dreams meant the deceased were visiting to deliver messages, usually to warn or scold. Waking from one of these could leave you shaken for days, unsure whether to pray, apologize, or move house. If you dreamed of your dead uncle, it wasn't nostalgia, it was customer service from the afterlife. Today we understand sleep paralysis as a biological glitch, not a demonic attack. But for the Tudors, it was proof of the unseen world pressing close. Their nights were filled with whispers, shadows, and unseen weight, reminders that the line between waking and dreaming was perilously thin. And though we've traded holy water for nightlights, the fear lingers. We still jolt awake from nightmares, hearts pounding, staring into the dark. Deep down, part of us still half expects to see Brenda, waiting patiently on the edge of the bed. The Tudors didn't sleep peacefully, and thanks to anxiety, neither do we. Some curses never end. In Tudor England, fear didn't just live in the dark, it lived next door. If your crops failed, your cow stopped giving milk, or your bread didn't rise, it wasn't bad luck or poor technique. No, someone had cursed you. And in a society built on gossip, God, and grudges, curses spread faster than the plague and burned twice as hot. Superstition turned ordinary misfortunes into moral indictments. Every village had that one person, the cranky widow, the outspoken spinster, the man with too many cats, who became the perfect scapegoat when life went wrong. Just stop there. You didn't need proof of magic. You just needed a story. In Tudor England, community spirit meant blaming someone else's spirit. To the Tudor mind, words were powerful, dangerously so. A curse wasn't just a mean comment. It was an act of weaponized speech. Saying "may misfortune follow you" was essentially launching a spiritual missile. This belief had deep roots in both Christian and pagan tradition. The Bible itself spoke of blessings and curses shaping fate. So when someone shouted an insult that later came true, it wasn't coincidence, it was evidence. Even muttering angrily in the street could get you accused. Villagers feared ill wishes, casual grumblings believed to twist luck. If someone you argued with later lost a chicken or fell ill, congratulations, you are now a witch. Tudor argument tip: never say you'll regret this unless you enjoy trial by torchlight. Curses were terrifying, but also weirdly practical. People used them in secret to get revenge, settle feuds, or just vent frustration. It was the Tudor version of subtweeting. Some cursing specialists even offered their services for a fee. They weren't officially witches, just people who knew how to speak with intent. For the right price, they'd carve a name into wax, whisper a few Latinish phrases, and promise that your enemy's bread would mould or their cow would miscarry. Of course, if you suspected you'd been cursed, there were countermeasures. Charms, holy water, blessed salt, or wearing your underwear inside out. Yes, that was genuinely considered protective. Others used curse tablets, inscribed pieces of lead buried at crossroads to reverse bad magic. The Tudors didn't believe in therapy, but they did believe in yelling their enemies' names into metal plates and burying them in public. Once a rumour started, it rarely stopped. One unlucky event led to another, and soon the entire village was caught in a feedback loop of fear. A farmer's cow dies? Witchcraft. His son breaks a leg? Double witchcraft. Someone sneezes at church? The devil himself was probably hiding behind the pulpit. Suspicion could escalate over the smallest gestures. A woman who refused to lend milk or muttered about being mistreated might be branded ill-willed. If she later looked at your crops and they wilted, well, clearly her eyes had hexed them, and once the label of witch attached, it stuck harder than tar. People crossed themselves when you passed. Children threw stones. Even your cat started looking nervous. In Tudor England, a bad mood was basically an arrest warrant. By the mid-1500s, England's paranoia went national. Parliament passed laws making witchcraft and cursing punishable by death. What began as village superstition became state policy. Courts didn't need physical proof, only testimony. And testimony usually came from people with long memories and short tempers. A neighbour might recall you glaring once in 1543, and that was enough. She looked at me strangely. Could become she cursed my cow by the next hearing. Confessions were often coerced. Suspects were interrogated for hours, sometimes sleep-deprived or forced to pray out loud until they slipped and admitted guilt. And if you did confess, you might be executed mercifully by hanging instead of burned alive. Tudor compassion at its finest. Justice in Tudor England was simple. If it rained after you sneezed, you were guilty. Authorities began searching for evidence on bodies, strange moles, scars or birthmarks, which they called witch marks. These were supposedly spots where demons suckled, because nothing says rigorous investigation like examining your suspect's freckles. Objects like pins, poppets, cloth dolls, or jars of herbs were also damning. A woman caught with a bundle of dried plants might claim she was making medicine. Her neighbours would insist she was cooking sin. Even having too much knowledge was dangerous. A midwife, herbalist, or healer could easily be rebranded as a witch. Knowledge that once saved lives suddenly became a death sentence. In Tudor England, the cure for ignorance was witch trials. The cure for witch trials was more ignorance. At its heart, the fear of cursing was about control, or rather the lack of it. The world was unpredictable. Plague struck, weather ruined crops, kings died, and wars drained fortunes. Believing someone caused misfortune, even through malice or magic, gave people a sense of order. Blaming a witch meant the chaos had a reason, and once the witch was gone, everything would surely return to normal. It rarely did, but by then, the bonfire had already done its work. For the Tudors, cause and effect was easy. Everything bad came from someone you didn't like. Even when witch trials faded, the fear of curses lingered. People still avoided angry words, still whispered blessings over bread, and still blamed strange luck on unseen forces. The superstition outlived the executions, because fear is harder to burn than wood. Today, we might laugh at the idea of curses, until our Wi-Fi cuts out right after we insult someone online. Maybe human nature hasn't changed that much. We still look for villains when things go wrong. We've just replaced witches with algorithms. Tudor panic gave us witch hunts. Modern panic gave us customer service hotlines. Progress is questionable. When you think of Tudor monarchs, you might picture royal decrees, political cunning, and lavish banquets. But behind the crowns and portraits was a quieter truth. England's rulers were just as superstitious as their subjects. They simply had more money to spend on their paranoia. From enchanted rings to prophetic stars, Tudor royalty mixed faith, politics, and the occult like ingredients in a royal potion. Magic wasn't something whispered about in back alleys. It was practiced in palaces, often right under the nose of the church. The Tudors didn't separate religion and superstition, they just taxed one of them. The Tudor dynasty began with Henry VII, a king so cautious he practically invented anxiety. After seizing the throne in 1485, he lived in constant fear of losing it again. Rumours of pretenders and curses followed him everywhere. To cope, he turned to astrologers, relics, and wise men who promised glimpses of the future for a price. He consulted soothsayers before important decisions, carried relics of saints for luck, and even commissioned charms to preserve his person from mischance. Every coin he minted bore hidden symbols of divine protection. His obsession with omens bordered on professional paranoia, but in fairness, for a man who founded a dynasty by chance and battle, the stars probably felt more reliable than his nobles. Henry VII didn't trust people, he trusted planetary alignments. His son, Henry VIII, inherited both the throne and the superstition. Beneath the armour and ego, Henry was deeply insecure, constantly hunting for signs of divine favour. Every victory was proof that God loved him. Every illness or failed marriage meant someone had hexed him. Henry wore charms for good fortune and commissioned holy relics to bless his court. When his wives failed to produce male heirs, he interpreted it as spiritual sabotage. Catherine of Aragon's miscarriages weren't biology. They were God's punishment or perhaps witchcraft from jealous courtiers. Anne Boleyn's infamous sixth finger and fascination with astrology made her an easy target for suspicion, and her downfall was laced with whispered talk of enchantment. Even his break from Rome had hints of magical destiny. Henry believed himself divinely chosen to reform the church, though cynics might say he just wanted an annulment. Still, he often sought astrological timing for political acts, waiting for favourable planetary conjunctions before signing major decrees. Henry VIII consulted both lawyers and astrologers. Only one of them lost their head. Mary I, or Bloody Mary to her critics, wasn't dabbling in star charts. She saw the world in apocalyptic terms. For her, omens weren't curiosities, they were prophecies. Her reign was haunted by bad signs. Comets streaked the sky, storms battered London, and rumours of ghostly lights over Smithfield, where heretics burned, spread like wildfire. People whispered that the heavens themselves wept over her persecutions. Mary, however, interpreted these as tests from God, proof that Satan was resisting her holy mission to restore Catholicism. When she suffered phantom pregnancies, some claimed witchcraft, others blamed divine punishment. Either way, Mary clung to relics, masses and blessings, hoping to restore England's soul and her own womb. Mary the Frost prayed for a miracle and got bad PR instead. Then came Elizabeth I, the most glittering and the most magical of all the Tudors. Outwardly, she projected confidence and reason. Secretly, her court was a hive of alchemists, astrologers and occultists. Her most famous advisor was Dr. John Dee, mathematician, astronomer and part-time sorcerer. Dee wasn't your average court scholar. He claimed to speak with angels through crystal balls and shoe stones. Elizabeth trusted him so completely that she called on him to choose auspicious dates for her coronation, voyages and treaties. To the court, Dee was a mysterious genius. To commoners, he was England's wizard, the real-life Merlin serving a red-haired queen. His library overflowed with books on alchemy and magic. His mirror, made of black obsidian, was said to summon spirits. Elizabeth herself wore enchanted rings and consulted horoscopes. She even had her own lucky dress, reserved for critical state occasions. But she played her superstition carefully, publicly favouring God, privately trusting the stars. Elizabeth ruled by reason, but only after Mercury was out of retrograde. For the Tudors, superstition wasn't just belief, it was brand management. Every monarch wanted to look chosen by heaven. Comets became royal PR events. Henry VII claimed one heralded his victory at Bosworth. Elizabeth's supporters called her the Star of England, aligning her rule with celestial prophecy. Portraits were filled with coded symbols: eyes for divine wisdom, suns for royal virtue, serpents for knowledge. These weren't random decorations, they were magical advertising. A Tudor monarch was part politician, part living charm against chaos. The Tudors invented influencer marketing. They just used comets instead of hashtags. But royal superstition could turn dangerous. Predicting the monarch's future, even astrologically, was considered treason. Elizabeth I's government banned fortune-telling about her death. A wise move, given how eager her courtiers were to calculate their promotions. Astrologers caught making predictions about royal succession could be jailed or executed. Yet ironically, the same monarchs who outlawed prophecy secretly hired astrologers themselves. It was a delicate balance, condemning witchcraft in public, commissioning horoscopes in private. The Tudor crown hated witches, unless they were on payroll. The Tudors ruled during an age teetering between faith and reason. Science was dawning, but old fears still ruled the night. Their fascination with omens reflected a truth about power, that even the mighty crave reassurance from the unknown, from Henry's cursed marriages to Elizabeth's magical mirrors. Superstition wasn't weakness, it was survival strategy, a way to make sense of chaos when the world refused to behave. In the end, Tudor monarchs weren't that different from their subjects, just better dressed and more superstitious about it. In Tudor England, time wasn't something you checked, it was something you felt, feared, and occasionally blamed for your problems. There were no pocket watches, no phone screens, and definitely no concept of "I'll meet you at 3:30. People lived by bells, sunlight and superstition. Time to the Tudors wasn't neutral. Every hour had a personality. Holy or dangerous, lucky or cursed. Choosing when to sow crops, travel, pray, or even sneeze mattered. The wrong hour could bring disaster. The right one might bring divine favour. Being late in Tudor England wasn't rude, it was potentially fatal. Before mechanical clocks became common, most people told time using the church bells. Each village bell marked hours of prayer: matins before dawn, prime at sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none mid-afternoon, vespers at sunset, and compline before bed. For the average villager, a clock didn't exist. You said things like "at first light," "when the bell rings for sext," or "when my shadow's as long as the cow." It was a flexible system, unless you wanted precision, in which case, good luck. Wealthy households sometimes owned sundials or hourglasses, though both had their issues. Sundials only worked when the sun showed up, and hourglasses required constant flipping. Imagine scheduling your day around the weather and your servant's attention span. Tudor timekeeping, where your productivity depended on the cloud cover. Each hour was believed to have a spiritual charge. Early morning was sacred, the time for prayer and renewal. Midday was dangerous, when the sun's heat stirred up restless spirits. Midnight, of course, belonged to the devil. Church doctrine reinforced this rhythm. Praying at the canonical hours aligned your day with heaven's schedule, but stepping outside those times or working through them risked spiritual offence. Farmers paused ploughing to kneel as the bells rang, lest their fields grow cursed wheat. The witching hour, though not yet named as such, was already feared. People believed spirits and demons were most active between midnight and 3, a godless gap when prayers faded and the dead wandered. Anyone awake then, bakers, guards, or insomniacs, were viewed with mild suspicion. Staying up late in Tudor England was the fastest way to get accused of witchcraft or insomnia possession. Folk wisdom divided the day into fortunate and forbidden times. It was unlucky to begin a journey at dusk, as that was when wandering souls sought company. Noon, on the other hand, was perfect for baptisms and weddings unless the sky clouded over, in which case God was clearly frowning on your plans. Tradesmen consulted planetary hours, assigning each hour of the day to a celestial ruler. Venus's hour favoured love. Mars's hour favoured war or surgery, which were disturbingly similar back then, and Saturn's hour should be avoided at all costs. Starting anything during Saturn's reign, especially travel or contracts, meant doom. Even household chores followed the clock's cosmic mood. Churning butter or baking bread during dark hours could spoil the batch. Blacksmiths refused to forge iron at dawn, believing the weak sun made the metal rebellious. Tudor productivity tip: if your butter failed, it wasn't your technique. Mercury was just in a bad mood. Work and worship were inseparable. In Tudor rhythm, church bells didn't just tell time, they told you when to stop doing whatever sinful thing you were doing and repent immediately. Ignoring the bells could bring bad luck or social shame. If a farmer ploughed through vespers, neighbours might mutter that his wheat would grow with worms. A fisherman who sailed during compline risked storms. Even craftsmen avoided hammering during prayers, lest the noise offend angels. Of course, some people cheated. They pretended to pray while secretly measuring the light or counting their coins. But in small villages, someone always noticed. The sound of skipping prayers spread faster than gossip, and that's saying something. In Tudor towns, not stopping for prayer was like skipping the Wi-Fi password at church. Everyone noticed. Time wasn't just about daily routine. It shaped destiny. A baby's birth hour determined its nature. Born at dawn, blessed and diligent. Born at midnight, doomed to restlessness or witchcraft. Astrologers charted natal hours, assigning personality traits and fates based on planetary influence. Death, too, had its hours. Dying at noon was seen as holy. The soul rose with the sun. Dying at twilight, however, was ominous. It meant your spirit might wander. Families even delayed announcing deaths until sunrise, so neighbours wouldn't whisper about restless souls dying out of time. If you were born at midnight and died at dusk, Tudor society basically gave up on you. Journeys were planned with the clock in mind, or at least the bell. Setting off too early risked demons in the mist. Too late, and you'd meet spirits in the dark. Many travellers waited until the church bell struck prime, the first official daylight prayer, before crossing bridges or forests. Sailors were especially superstitious. The first hour after dawn was the only safe time to cast off, blessed by the sun's resurrection. Departing under the moon invited misfortune, storms, or mermaids, which in Tudor belief were all equally deadly. Tudor travel insurance came in two forms: a priest's blessing and very low expectations. By the late 1500s, mechanical clocks began appearing in town squares, loud, temperamental beasts that refused to agree with the bells. For the first time, people had to reconcile mechanical time with holy time, and it caused more confusion than progress. Villagers argued whether the fourth hour meant God's hour or the machine's. Some insisted the devil himself had made clocks to disrupt divine rhythm. Others marvelled at their precision, treating them almost like relics. In truth, clocks didn't make life simpler, they made it stricter. Time became something you could be late to, and that was a whole new sin to worry about. Before clocks, the Tudors feared hell. After clocks, they feared being late for dinner. Modern schedules may look rational, but the ghost of Tudor timekeeping lingers. We still call midnight the witching hour, we still fear bad timing, and we still think luck can depend on when something begins. For the Tudors, hours weren't mechanical divisions, they were moral landscapes. Each tick of the day carried meaning, and every shadow had a warning. The Tudors didn't just live by time, they survived it, one suspicious hour at a time. In Tudor England, animals weren't just animals, they were cosmic employees. Every cat, crow, and cow carried hidden meaning. People didn't see them as dumb beasts, but as spiritual intermediaries, creatures capable of ferrying messages between heaven, earth, and occasionally the local churchyard. The Tudor world was alive with signs. Hooting owls, barking dogs, and mysterious rats crossing thresholds all meant something. To ignore an animal's behaviour was to risk missing a divine or demonic memo. In Tudor England, your pet wasn't a companion, it was your unpaid spiritual advisor. Cats were the most misunderstood animals of the Tudor era. On one hand, they were indispensable for keeping barns and granaries free of mice. On the other, they were suspected of being in league with the devil, sleek, nocturnal, and alarmingly independent. Black cats especially drew suspicion. They were said to be witches' familiars, spirits that took animal form to assist in dark magic. A witch's cat wasn't a pet, it was an accomplice. If one appeared at your door and refused to leave, you didn't feed it, you prayed. But cats also had divine associations. Sailors carried them aboard ships for luck, believing their calm predicted fair weather and their hissing foretold storms. Some households even burned the bodies of dead cats inside walls. Yes, really, as apotropaic charms to ward off evil spirits. It was an odd duality. Cats were both sacred protectors and demonic spies. They guarded homes from vermin and possibly from hell itself, though Tudor theology never quite decided which side they were on. Owning a cat in Tudor England was like living with a tiny, furry moral dilemma. If an owl hooted near your house, condolences were in order. The Tudors saw owls as death's messengers, birds that guided souls to the other side. Their eerie nocturnal cries were said to echo from the spirit world. Farmers claimed owls perched on rooftops before someone in the household died. Graveyards teemed with them, not because of ghosts, but because they were full of tasty mice. Still, logic rarely stood a chance against fear. In literature and folklore, owls symbolized wisdom, but also doom. Shakespeare, a bit later, would immortalize that duality, but it was already well established. A wise creature that haunted cemeteries was both terrifying and trustworthy. Some midwives even warned new mothers to cover their infants' cradles if they heard an owl outside. Otherwise, the baby's soul might follow its call. If an owl hooted in Tudor England, nobody slept, not from fear of ghosts, but from waiting to see who'd die first. Dogs were more warmly regarded, yet equally superstitious. They guarded homes, hunted game, and warned of visitors, both mortal and supernatural. If a dog howled for no reason, it wasn't nothing, it was everything. People believed dogs could see spirits invisible to human eyes. A howl near a sickbed meant a soul was about to depart. A dog refusing to enter a room suggested the presence of an unclean force. Churchyards were said to have church grims, spectral black dogs that protected the dead from grave robbers and witches. Ironically, the same kind of black dog seen wandering at night was considered an omen of death. Farmers, however, loved dogs unconditionally. A loyal hound symbolized faith, courage, and good luck. Nobles gifted prized greyhounds as signs of favor. But a mad dog bite, rabies, was seen as literal possession. Victims were said to be ridden by the devil, their madness proof of infernal infection. To the Tudors, every barking dog was a saint, until it bit someone, then it was a demon. Worth! If cats were complicated, rats were unambiguously bad news. They were carriers of plague, thieves of grain, and harbingers of doom. Seeing a rat scurry across your floor could mean sickness or poverty. If one climbed your bedpost, it meant death. During plague years, people swore rats appeared in unnatural numbers before outbreaks, as if sent by hell itself. Rats were thought to carry the souls of the damned, or at least serve as transportation for them. Yet rats also had bizarre symbolic roles. Some sailors refused to kill them aboard ships, believing they were tied to the ship's luck. If rats fled the vessel, it meant it was doomed, which, to be fair, turned out to be pretty accurate. Mice, being smaller and less villainous, were given minor spiritual credit. They were believed to nibble away sin in old churches, literally cleaning the world of wickedness one crumb at a time. In Tudor superstition, rats predicted plague, mice redeemed sin, and neither paid rent. Crows and ravens were practically feathered grim reapers. Their black plumage, scavenger habits, and unnerving intelligence made them perfect candidates for supernatural suspicion. A single crow perched on a roof meant death. Two together meant good fortune, unless they flew east, in which case it was back to death again. The system was not consistent. Some believed ravens carried the souls of the dead to heaven. Others thought they stole them for hell. Their croaks were interpreted as warnings. Villagers even tried bribing ravens with food to soften their prophecies. If a Tudor heard a raven caw, they didn't say cool bird. They started updating their will. Not all animals inspired fear. Robins were holy birds, said to have pulled thorns from Christ's crown, staining their breasts red. Swallows symbolized resurrection as they returned each spring. Even toads and frogs had minor magical reputations, used in medicine and charms, provided you didn't mind holding something slimy while praying. Livestock had spiritual weight too. Cows that refused to give milk were bewitched. Horses that shied away for no reason had seen the devil. Farmers tied ribbons to their tails or whispered blessings into their ears to keep them cooperative. A bizarre, affectionate mix of faith and farm management. Every Tudor farmer was part theologian, part animal therapist. The Tudor relationship with animals revealed something profound. They didn't see themselves as separate from nature, but surrounded by it and at its mercy. Animals weren't just creatures, they were barometers of morality, reflections of unseen forces, and sometimes unlucky co-workers in humanity's daily struggle to stay alive. The line between pet, omen, and messenger blurred constantly. A barking dog could save your soul, a hooting owl could doom your family, and a purring cat could either protect you from demons or report your sins directly to them. The Tudors didn't need spirit guides, they had barnyard surveillance. In Tudor England, water wasn't just something you drank or avoided because it made you sick. It was sacred, dangerous, and occasionally magical. It was one of the few elements that could purify the body and soul at once. You didn't bathe to smell better. You bathed to stay spiritually off the devil's radar. The Tudors might not have understood germs, but they were experts in symbolic cleanliness. For them, water was alive. It carried blessings, curses, and divine presence depending on where it flowed. A river could heal or haunt you. A well could be holy or haunted. And if you washed at the wrong time or in the wrong place, you might come out worse than you went in. A Tudor bath was less about hygiene and more about spiritual misdirection, like camouflage for your soul. Long before the Tudors, sacred springs and wells had dotted England's landscape, ancient pagan sites later baptized by the church to bring them under Christian management. By the 1500s, these holy wells were pilgrimage spots for anyone needing a miracle, a cure, or a good excuse for a day off work. Each well had its specialty. Some healed blindness, others eased childbirth, and a few promised protection from witchcraft. Pilgrims would drink from them, wash in them, or toss in coins and ribbons as offerings. A well dedicated to St. Winifred, for instance, was said to cure any disease, though possibly at the cost of catching something new from the communal water. Local superstition warned that wells could see intentions. If you approached a sacred spring with doubt, it might refuse to help, but approach humbly, and it could cleanse your sins or at least your rash. A Tudor holy well was basically a 16th century customer service line. Results not guaranteed, no refunds accepted. The act of washing, or rather ritual washing, was central to Tudor spirituality. True, many people bathed infrequently, and some bragged about it. But when they did, it often came with prayers, charms, or holy water. Holy water itself was a powerful weapon. Churches kept barrels of it to sprinkle on babies, livestock, and anything that moved suspiciously after midnight. People carried small bottles home to protect their thresholds, beds, or butter churns. In rural communities, water from a church font was mixed into cleaning water at Easter to renew the home. It wasn't meant to scrub dirt, it was meant to scrub evil. And before major life events like weddings or births, families might wash their hands and faces in water blessed by a priest, symbolically rinsing off bad luck. To a Tudor, the only thing stronger than soap was sanctified splash damage. If demons were real, and to the Tudors they absolutely were, water was your first line of defense. Evil couldn't cross running water. Everyone knew that. That's why bridges were considered spiritually safe zones, though admittedly less so if they were rotting. Suspected witches were often tested with water, the infamous swimming test. The idea was that pure water rejected the impure. Witches would float while innocent souls would sink. Naturally, this meant your options were drown or hang. Theological logic at its finest. People also poured water over doorsteps to block spirits. Some placed bowls of it beneath beds to trap nightmares. And at funerals, mourners washed their hands before entering the house again, ensuring no ghostly residue followed them home. In Tudor England, if you didn't drown, you were a witch. If you did drown, congratulations, you were innocent. Of course, not all water was blessed. Many rivers and wells were feared for harbouring angry spirits. Wells that dried up or overflowed were considered signs of divine displeasure. If someone fell ill after drinking from one, it wasn't bacteria, it was a curse. In London, the Thames was both lifeline and landfill. It carried everything from merchant ships to plague victims, and yet people still used its water for cooking, cleaning, and occasionally healing. When disease struck, they blamed not filth but sin, believing the water mirrored humanity's moral decay. There were even stories of haunted wells, places that whispered at night or reflected faces not your own. Villagers avoided them, or if desperate, left offerings, coins, cloth strips, or prayers to placate whatever lurked within. If your reflection blinked back at you in Tudor England, it wasn't exhaustion, it was time to move. Rain itself had moral weight. A sudden shower during a sermon meant divine approval. A thunderstorm during a feast meant wrath. Collecting rainwater on certain feast days was said to cure ailments, though only if stored in a clean vessel, which in Tudor England was wishful thinking. Floods were seen as divine punishment, especially when they ruined ale supplies. People processed through towns with banners and relics, praying for the water to recede, a pious but soggy affair. And droughts? Proof that sin had literally dried up God's patience. Still, the connection between water and the sacred ran deep. Baptisms symbolized rebirth. Holy wells promised redemption. Even superstition carried a kind of poetry, that water could remember, forgive, and punish in equal measure. In Tudor weather reports, a drizzle was mercy, a flood was judgment, and thunder was God sighing heavily. Water cleansed, but it also judged. Its presence in Tudor life represented both hope and fear, a reflection of a world where cleanliness was more spiritual than physical. To bathe was to purify your soul, not your armpits. To drink was to risk your health but save your conscience. The Tudors treated water as a divine negotiator, unpredictable, sacred, and slightly judgmental. It healed, punished, and occasionally whispered, and though their logic may seem strange, their faith in the unseen ripples of the world was unshakable. They didn't fear what was in the water, they feared what the water knew about them. For the Tudor peasant, life was a series of negotiations, not just with the landlord or the weather, but with fate itself. Every morning brought new risks, demons, curses, bad omens, and whatever your neighbour's cat was plotting. The church taught faith, but experience taught superstition, and most peasants carried both like mismatched tools in the same belt. Their days ran on patterns of fear and familiarity. To modern eyes, it might look exhausting, but for them superstition wasn't madness, it was insurance. In a world where medicine failed, crops died, and kings changed religion every other decade, you needed every charm, prayer, and bit of luck you could find. Faith kept your soul safe. Superstition kept your chickens alive. A peasant's morning began with small rituals that made sense to absolutely no one except their maker. When waking, it was vital to step out of bed with the right foot first, or risk bad luck all day. The left foot was unlucky. That was the devil's side. You didn't want to trip into his schedule before breakfast. Before leaving the house, people muttered blessings or traced small crosses on their doors. Many homes had sprigs of herbs, rosemary, rue, or rowan, hanging above the threshold to block spirits. Some spat on their hands for good luck. Others whispered a short prayer before touching metal or wood. And if you sneezed before dawn, you stayed indoors. Early sneezing was an omen that your soul wasn't yet properly anchored for the day. In Tudor England, getting out of bed was the most dangerous part of your morning routine. Even mealtime carried invisible weight. Before taking the first bite, peasants often made the sign of the cross over their bread, not out of piety, but because evil spirits loved to hide in loaves. If your bread fell butter side down, it wasn't clumsiness, it was bad luck and possibly witchcraft. Salt was sacred. Spilling it invited disaster, but tossing a pinch over your left shoulder could blind the devil waiting there. Peasants didn't waste salt easily, but when they did, it was considered a small investment in spiritual security, and if your spoon slipped or your ale foamed strangely, you'd better stop eating. It might be an omen of illness, or worse, death. The Tudors didn't believe in food poisoning, they believed in moral poisoning. If your porridge boiled over, it wasn't bad cooking, it was divine criticism. When heading to the fields, timing and direction mattered. Walking north before sunrise was unlucky. It led against the light. Starting work without saying a prayer could offend the saints, who apparently moonlighted as agricultural supervisors. Tools were treated with reverence. Dropping a ploughshare foretold a poor harvest. Breaking a sickle meant you'd angered your guardian spirit. And if you killed a toad while hoeing, congratulations, you'd just doomed your crops for the season. Animals also set the mood. If crows followed you to the fields, it meant rain or death, depending on how many appeared. Bees hovering around your head meant profit. A dog lying in your path meant turn back immediately. No one risked ignoring such omens, because if you disobeyed them and something did go wrong, everyone would say, "Well, you were warned." In Tudor England, even your livestock were on first-name terms with destiny. The Tudor landscape was mapped with invisible warnings. Crossroads, in particular, were places where worlds overlapped, where ghosts, witches, and lost souls wandered. You didn't stop there, not even to tie your shoe. Many suicides were buried at crossroads to confuse their spirits so they couldn't find their way home. Travellers avoided roads that ran through ancient ruins, graveyards, or lonely woods. If they had no choice, they carried charms, iron keys, bits of bread, or even dried toads to keep spirits at bay. Meeting a red-haired stranger or a limping beggar on the road was bad luck. Best to turn around and try again tomorrow. And heaven forbid you heard footsteps behind you when walking alone at dusk. If you did, you didn't look back ever. It might be a spirit that vanished when faced, or worse, one that didn't. In Tudor geography, every shortcut was haunted, and every scenic route ended in regret. By sunset, the peasant's day turned inward. The fading light was dangerous. It was when the in-between things, spirits, curses and nightmares grew restless. People shut their doors early and stuffed herbs in cracks or chimneys to block entry. The fire in the hearth was sacred. You never let it go out at night. A cold hearth meant an invitation to spirits. Some families tossed salt into the flames for protection, while others whispered short blessings as the fire dimmed. The last ember was called the soul spark, and if it went out suddenly, someone in the family might soon follow. Shoes were turned upside down to prevent wandering souls from walking into them, and brooms were left bristle up to block witches from entering. Even the way you lay in bed mattered. Feet toward the door was a bad sign, as that was how corpses were carried out. Tudor bedtime wasn't restful, it was strategic demon deterrence. Peasants weren't irrational, they were cautious. Every charm, prayer, and taboo was a way of managing risk in a world where control was scarce. If your cow died or your child fell ill, it was comforting to think there was a reason, even if that reason involved a goblin or an angry saint. Superstition made daily life predictable. It gave structure to chaos. meaning to misfortune, and purpose to the mundane. The Tudors didn't live in a world of science. They lived in a world of symbols where every step, sneeze and shadow mattered. Modern people check the weather app. Tudors checked the nearest omen and hoped it wasn't an owl. By the end of the Tudor century, England was changing, not just politically, but intellectually. The same country that once blamed witches for storms and prayed over butter churns was slowly, awkwardly discovering reason. But this was no overnight enlightenment. It was more like a messy divorce between faith and fear, with centuries of superstition refusing to pack its bags quietly. The late 1500s stood on a cultural fault line. On one side, ghosts, astrology, charms, and holy wells. On the other, experimentation, astronomy, and anatomy. People still hung horseshoes above their doors, but now they might also own a book explaining why the Earth revolved around the sun. The shift didn't erase old beliefs, it simply taught them better Latin. England didn't stop believing in magic, it just started calling it natural philosophy. The Tudor intellectual revolution began in the universities, those candlelit laboratories of argument and ink. Thinkers like Francis Bacon, William Gilbert, and John Dee, Elizabeth I's astrologer turned astronomer, started asking dangerous questions like, what if we actually tested things instead of accusing our neighbours? Bacon promoted empiricism, the radical idea that truth should be observed, not inherited. Instead of relying on scripture or tradition, scholars were told to gather data, perform experiments, and take notes, basically the scientific method in its training wheels phase. Meanwhile, Dr. William Gilbert wrote De Magnete 1600, the first serious study of magnetism. Before him, magnets were thought to have occult power, possibly demonic. Gilbert, however, suggested they were natural phenomena. This was revolutionary, turning witchcraft into physics. Gilbert proved magnets weren't magical, disappointing thousands of witches, but delighting future refrigerator doors. If there was ever a man who embodied this transition, it was Dr. John Dee, Elizabeth's resident scholar and part-time conjurer. He owned one of the largest libraries in England and studied everything: astronomy, alchemy, geometry, navigation, and angelic communication. Yes, that too. And he calculated the best date for Elizabeth's coronation using astrology, but also developed early theories of navigation that helped launch English exploration. He advised captains on routes using mathematics, a science that still smelled suspiciously of sorcery to the uneducated. To many, Dee was proof that magic and science were just cousins in different outfits. His crystal ball sessions may seem eccentric, but they reflected a mind trying to understand the cosmos, not through blind faith but through pattern and number. John Dee could summon angels, predict eclipses, and still probably got strange looks at dinner. The rise of the printing press in Tudor England changed everything. Books that once cost a fortune could now reach merchants, scholars, and even curious farmers. Superstitious pamphlets still sold well. Witch stories were the tabloid news of their day. But new ideas about medicine, astronomy, and logic began circulating like wildfire. The Bible itself, newly translated into English, encouraged people to read, interpret, and think. Suddenly, ordinary minds had access to knowledge once monopolized by priests and scholars. Literacy spread reason like yeast in warm ale, slowly but irresistibly. Scientific works by Copernicus and Galileo trickled into England, scandalizing theologians but thrilling thinkers. The stars, once ruled by astrology, became objects of measurement. The heavens were less about prophecy now, and more about physics. The printing press spread knowledge faster than gossip, and that's saying something for Tudor England. Medicine, too, began its hesitant journey out of the Middle Ages. Traditional healers still used charms and frog amulets, but university-trained physicians were beginning to adopt anatomical study. Dissections, once considered blasphemous, became tools for understanding rather than condemning. The Tudor belief that illness came from bad air or divine punishment was giving way to theories of humours and balance, precursors to actual medical science. It wasn't modern by any means. Leeches were still on the payroll, but the mindset was shifting from supernatural causes to natural explanations. Hospitals, previously more like spiritual hospices, began experimenting with treatment and observation. Patients might still get holy water, but they also got bed rest and diet plans, a small step for health, a giant leap for hygiene. Tudor medicine was still medieval, but at least it had started washing its hands occasionally. Of course, not everyone applauded this new rationalism. The Church, already bruised by Reformation battles, viewed curiosity with suspicion. Questioning natural order meant questioning divine order, yet even clergy were forced to adapt. Some preachers began explaining miracles as God's laws of nature, merging science with theology to stay relevant. Astrology textbooks were rebranded as astronomy. Alchemy became chemistry. Heresy, apparently, was just a matter of branding. Meanwhile, witch trials still occurred, but skepticism was growing. Judges started demanding evidence. Physicians were called in to testify whether symptoms of possession might actually be medical. The age of blind panic was ending. Slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. When your witch trials start including expert witnesses, you know the Enlightenment is warming up. Still, the old fears refused to die. For every new thinker proposing logic, there were 10 peasants clinging to charms. Even the learned hedged their bets. Scholars studied the stars by day and burned protective herbs by night. But progress crept in, one cautious experiment at a time. Mathematics replaced magic in navigation. Observation replaced omen in weather prediction. And though superstition still ruled the taverns, reason was quietly taking over the universities. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, England stood at the threshold of a new world, one where the future belonged not to charm sellers and prophets, but to thinkers and tinkerers. The seeds of modern science had been planted in the very soil once watered with holy wells and witch trials. The Tudors didn't abandon superstition, they just gave it a lab coat and a Latin name. The late Tudor shift from magic to reason didn't erase wonder, it redirected it. People still marvelled at the stars, the body and the elements, but now they sought understanding rather than appeasement. The world didn't feel less mysterious, just less haunted. The same culture that once feared demons under the bed would soon build telescopes to look for angels in the stars. It was the beginning of the modern age, born not from the death of superstition, but from its transformation into curiosity. Tudor England didn't outgrow magic, it reinvented it as science with better lighting. The Tudor world may be long gone, its plague carts, its charms, its frantic prayers over spoiled milk, but its superstitions never really died. They simply changed clothes. Modern life may look scientific and rational, but scratch beneath the surface and you'll find the Tudors alive and well, whispering in our daily habits. Every good luck we mutter, every knock on wood, every shiver at a black cat, those are Tudor ghosts, still haunting our routines, politely disguised as quirks. Because for all our technology and logic, humanity hasn't evolved out of fear. We've just found Wi-Fi-friendly ways to express it. We traded witch hunts for web searches, but we're still Googling symptoms and blaming demons. They just go by different names now. Let's start with the sneeze, one of the most persistent relics of Tudor superstition. When someone sneezed in the 1500s, it wasn't just an awkward noise, it was a crisis. The Tudors believed sneezing could literally launch your soul out of your body, leaving it vulnerable to demons or death. The phrase "God bless you" wasn't courtesy, it was crisis management. It acted as a spiritual safety net, snapping your soul back before the devil could grab it. Everyone, from peasants to nobles, participated. Even Queen Elizabeth I was said to have offered blessings when courtiers sneezed, though perhaps with more regal restraint. And centuries later, we're still doing it, though most of us couldn't say why. We may not believe our souls are playing hide and seek, but some primal part of us still feels safer after saying "bless you." 500 years later, we still fear sneezing, only now it's because someone might think we have a cold. Knocking on wood remains one of the world's most common good luck rituals, and one of the oldest. The Tudors inherited it from ancient folk traditions that claimed spirits lived inside trees. To knock on wood was to call on those spirits for protection, or to thank them for keeping misfortune away. When Christianized Tudor England, it was reinterpreted as a nod to the wood of the cross, a little tap of reverence and reassurance that fate was still on your side. Either way, it worked as a miniature prayer you could perform without alerting your priest or your neighbours. Today, we still do it instinctively, the quiet, panic tap on a table after saying something too optimistic. A tiny Tudor spell disguised as social reflex. The Tudors knocked on wood to please tree spirits. We do it to prevent jinxes, or at least to look busy during awkward silences. The Tudor obsession with lucky and unlucky times didn't vanish. It simply got new branding. Fridays were unlucky because Christ was crucified on one, and the 13th was unlucky because Judas was the 13th guest at the Last Supper. Combine the two, and you get Friday the 13th, a superstition that still sends shivers down office cubicles worldwide. Tudors refused to marry, travel, or start new ventures on certain days, and we still echo that hesitancy. How many people avoid signing contracts on Friday the 13th, or postpone trips after a bad omen? Even Monday blues have ancient roots. Medieval astrologers linked Mondays with the moon, a fickle and emotional planet. A bad Monday was practically guaranteed. We may have stopped blaming the moon for our moods, but it still gets suspiciously bright whenever our week goes wrong. Breaking a mirror brings 7 years bad luck, a belief straight out of Tudor superstition. Mirrors were rare and expensive in the 1500s, their glass polished with mercury and silver. Damaging one wasn't just costly, it was spiritually catastrophic. People believed mirrors held a fragment of the soul. Break one, and your reflection shattered too, letting misfortune seep in. That's why mirrors were covered during funerals, to prevent the dead from getting trapped or the living from catching their gaze. The 7 years came later, tied to the belief that the body renews itself every 7 years, meaning your broken luck would take that long to heal. Today, we might laugh, but how many of us still hesitate after breaking a mirror? Just for a second, that's your Tudor ancestry whispering. Good luck finding another soul. Tudor mirrors didn't just reflect, they judged. The poor black cat never recovered its Tudor reputation. Once seen as witchcraft's favourite pet, it became an unlucky omen in folklore that spread across Europe. Ironically, some countries, like Scotland, flipped the superstition. A black cat crossing your path meant wealth was coming. The Tudors would have called that heresy. Avoiding ladders also has medieval roots. A ladder leaning against a wall formed a triangle, the Holy Trinity. Walking through it was symbolically breaking the Trinity, and therefore inviting disaster. The Tudors didn't care much for geometry, but they respected triangles that threatened damnation. And spilling salt, as simple as it seems, remains one of our most enduring gestures of warding off evil. The throw it over your shoulder bit, straight out of Tudor kitchens. Evil spirits, they said, hovered behind the left shoulder. The devil sighed. Tossing salt blinded him before he could cause trouble. We don't believe in the devil anymore, but we'll still waste good salt to keep him on his toes. Our language still drips with Tudor superstition. We keep our fingers crossed, wish upon stars, and call some numbers unlucky. We say touch wood, break a leg, and jinx, all descendants of a world where fate could be bribed, appeased, or mocked. Even the word charm began as a literal incantation. And spell? That was once an actual spoken spell. We've simply absorbed the magical vocabulary of our ancestors into casual conversation. The Tudors whispered charms. We post them on Instagram and call it manifesting. What's fascinating is how superstition survived its own debunking. Once science began explaining the world, superstition didn't vanish. It adapted, slipping from religion into culture. It became less about fear and more about tradition, a cozy inheritance of irrationality that makes life feel a little more magical. When we knock on wood, bless a sneeze, or avoid walking under ladders, we're not afraid of demons. Not really. We're just honouring 500 years of human insecurity dressed up as wisdom. Because beneath the logic and the laughter lies a timeless truth. The Tudors weren't that different from us. They feared the unknown, we still do. They read signs in the world, we just call them vibes. We may have electricity, but deep down we're all still living in Tudor England, just with better plumbing.